Tonight, I want to tell you about a conflict that shattered one of the galaxy's most fundamental assumptions: the belief that the Jedi Order was, for all practical purposes, unbeatable. It is a story about the Mandalorians, not a single species, but a warrior culture defined by armor, code, and an understanding of combat that the Force-using Order never quite learned how to reckon with. And it spans thousands of years, from the moment the first Mandalorian faced a Jedi and realized that mysticism and meditation, for all their power, had limits. What fascinates me most about this history is not simply that Mandalorians could defeat Jedi. Many beings in the galaxy could do that, given enough luck or leverage. It is that they defeated them systematically, predictably, and in a way that revealed something uncomfortable about the Jedi Order's own mythology of invincibility. Over the time we spend together, we are going to move through that entire arc. How the Mandalorians rose, what made them different, the ancient wars that first tested the Jedi, and finally the moment in the Clone Wars when a warrior culture that had been preparing for this fight for millennia proved, once and for all, that it had never forgotten how. But before we step back into history, I want to begin with a single moment, a moment that serves as the thesis for everything that follows. It is a moment from the Clone Wars, that brutal conflict that tore the Republic apart, and it involves a woman named Duchess Satine Kryze. Satine ruled Mandalore during the Clone Wars, and she represented something that had not existed in her world for generations: peace. She had chosen neutrality, rejected the warrior past that defined her people, and built her government on the belief that strength could come from something other than conquest and combat. The Death Watch, a splinter faction of traditionalist Mandalorians, viewed this pacifism as a betrayal. They wanted to return Mandalore to what it had been: a martial culture, proud of its ability to wage war, secure in the knowledge that no enemy, not even the Jedi, could stand against them. The Death Watch were led by a man named Pre Vizsla, governor of Concordia, Mandalore's moon, and he carried with him a weapon that had belonged to his bloodline for 1,000 years, the Darksaber. This was not simply a lightsaber, it was the personal weapon of Tar Vizsla, the only Mandalorian in recorded history to become a Jedi Knight, wielded by him until his death, then claimed by his clan and kept as a symbol of Mandalorian dominion over any Force user foolish enough to face them. The Darksaber was, in essence, a promise. "We have beaten the Jedi before," it said, "and we will beat them again." Now, during the Clone Wars, a figure emerged that would change Mandalore forever. A figure who would kill Pre Vizsla, take the Darksaber, and use it to reshape not just Mandalore, but the entire balance of power in the galaxy. His name was Maul, and he was a Sith Lord who had survived being cut in half by Obi-Wan Kenobi on Naboo, his body held together by hate and cybernetics, and a hunger for revenge that had festered for a decade. Maul allied with the Death Watch, promising Pre Vizsla that together they could seize control of Mandalore from Satine and restore the warrior traditions that had been abandoned. Pre Vizsla agreed, and together they waged a campaign against the Duchess's pacifist government, building toward a final confrontation. But Maul had his own designs, and when the moment came, he faced Pre Vizsla not as an ally, but as a rival for power. In single combat, wielding the power of the Force, Maul defeated Pre Vizsla and beheaded him, taking the Darksaber for himself and claiming the right to rule Mandalore by conquest. And here is where the moment I want to linger on truly begins. With control of Mandalore and command of Death Watch warriors at his back, Maul sought to inflict maximum pain on his enemies, and his greatest enemy was Obi-Wan Kenobi. Maul lured Obi-Wan to Mandalore under false pretenses, and when the Jedi Master arrived, Maul revealed his trap. He had captured Satine, and he intended to kill her in front of Obi-Wan, to break him not through a clash of lightsabers, but through the destruction of someone he loved. Obi-Wan could do nothing to stop it. He could not find Maul in time, could not arrive before Satine was already condemned, could not save her through any application of Jedi wisdom or Jedi strength. He was forced to watch as the Duchess died. And what strikes me, thinking about this moment now, is not just the tragedy of it, though that is significant, but what it reveals about the nature of the conflict between these two peoples. The Jedi had always operated from a position of perceived superiority. They had the Force. They had an order spanning 10,000 years. They had trained warriors who could move with inhuman speed and bend reality to their will. The Mandalorians, by contrast, operated from a position of practical clarity. They did not trust in mysticism or meditation, or the belief that the Force would guide them toward victory. They trusted in armor that could not be cut, in weapons that could not be defended against, in tactics that had been refined through centuries of warfare against Force users and every other enemy the galaxy could produce. Beskar, the metal that formed the backbone of Mandalorian plate armor, was near indestructible, capable of deflecting blaster fire, and crucially, of withstanding the blade of a lightsaber, the Jedi's most iconic weapon. When a Jedi fought a Mandalorian, the Jedi's primary tool of combat became, suddenly and without warning, something that could not reliably cut through the enemy's body armor. Jetpacks gave Mandalorians mobility in 3 dimensions in a way that was difficult for even a Force-sensitive warrior to match. Wrist-mounted weapons, flamethrowers, grappling lines, dart launchers, extended their reach and gave them options beyond melee combat. Every piece of Mandalorian warfare doctrine had been developed, tested, and refined through generations of fighting beings who wielded the Force. When the Jedi finally encountered Mandalorians at scale, they discovered that the enemy had spent that same time preparing to fight them specifically. What makes this history remarkable is that it is not a story of luck or surprise overwhelming the Jedi Order. It is a story of the Mandalorians understanding, at a level that was almost philosophical, that the Jedi's greatest strength, their faith in the Force, their unity as an order, their belief in their own eventual victory, was also the source of a particular kind of blindness. The Jedi never quite accepted that they could be beaten, not really, not in the way that Mandalorians came to accept it and prepare for it. And when the moment finally came, when the mechanisms of history and conflict and individual choice all aligned, that assumption shattered completely. Over the next 20 chapters, we are going to walk backward and forward through time, tracing the origins of this conflict, the moments when ancient Mandalorians first faced Jedi and learned that the Force was not omnipotent, the great wars that followed, and finally, the events of the Clone Wars that brought the Jedi Order to the edge of extinction. But I wanted to begin here, in this moment with Obi-Wan and Satine and the Darksaber, because it shows you, in miniature, what this whole history is about. The gradual, methodical, centuries-long process by which one warrior culture learned to dismantle the mythology of another. It is a story of preparation meeting opportunity, and of a truth that the Jedi Order could never quite accept. That invincibility was not a given, but something that had to be maintained, and that if you failed to maintain it, if you grew too confident in your own mythology, then one day you would wake to find that the myth had failed you. So settle in, and let me take you back, not to the Clone Wars themselves, but much further back, to a time when the first Mandalorians were forging the metal that would change everything, and the Jedi Order still stood secure in the certainty of their power. Before the Jedi Order existed, before hyperspace routes connected the scattered worlds, there was a metal sleeping in red stone on a world that was not yet called Mandalore. The people who lived there then, the ones who would become the Mandarade, the children of Mandalore, they did not know yet that they were forging the only weapon that could answer the Force. They were simply trying to survive. The planet itself was hostile in ways that most worlds are not. The gravity was heavy, the atmosphere was thick, and scattered across its surface lived creatures of impossible size and ferocity, especially the mythosaur, beasts whose skulls would become the sigil of an entire civilization. Mining and metalwork were not luxuries in such a place. They were the difference between a life and a grave. The ore came up from deep shafts, and the armorers, the smiths whose names are mostly lost now, though we imagine them bent over forges in the red light of cooling metal, they began, quite methodically, to understand what this particular stone could do. Beskar, they called it, or Mandalorian iron, a substance with properties unlike anything common metallurgy had encountered before. It was dense, first of all, almost impossibly heavy in your hand, which meant it required different techniques to work than softer metals. You could not simply hammer it into shape with brute force. The heat required to soften it was extraordinary. The forges that worked Beskar became legendary, fed with fuel and patience and knowledge that was passed from master smith to apprentice as carefully as any other sacred thing. There is something worth dwelling on in that image. A young person watching an older one work, learning by repetition and attention where the metal wants to go, when it is ready to yield, and when it will break the tool instead. This was not the Jedi way, which relied on reaching outward into the Force, on sensing and guiding and feeling one's way toward truth. The Mandalorian way was different. It was about understanding matter as it actually was, heat and weight and the practical limits of physics, and then working with asterisk those limits rather than trying to transcend them. Over generations, and this is important, this was not something discovered in a moment of inspiration, but rather accumulated through centuries of trial and furnace fire and failure. The armorers learned something remarkable. Beskar, when properly worked and folded and shaped, could resist being cut. Most metals, when struck by an extremely hot, extremely sharp blade, the kind of blade a gifted warrior with force sensitivity might wield, would separate, would part like flesh. Beskar would not. It would dent, perhaps, or chip slightly at the edge, but the continuity of the metal itself remained unbroken. I think about what that discovery meant. The moment a smith held up a piece of shaped Beskar and a blade, lightsaber or otherwise, struck it and bounced away, and they understood that they had found something that the rest of the galaxy would take thousands of years to replicate. The ore itself could not be synthesized. It existed primarily on Mandalore and on Concordia, its moon, which meant that this knowledge, this advantage, could never truly be stolen or mass-produced by outsiders. It was tied to a place, which tied it to a people. The craft of working it became guarded knowledge, kept within families of armorers, shared only with those who had proven themselves worthy of the trust. In the language that would develop, Mandar, the Mandalorian tongue, the armor itself would be called Biskargam, and to where it became inseparable from what it meant to be Mandalorian at all. The phrase would eventually be codified in what the Mandalorians called the Rizalnea, the 6 actions, the core tenets of their people. Wearing the armor was not optional, not decorative, not a mark of rank or wealth, though it came to be that too. It was a statement of identity so fundamental that to lose your armor was, in a very real sense, to lose your claim to being Mandarade. But in those early forges, before any of that formalism, there was something simpler and more human, the understanding that they had found a way to be safe. In a galaxy that would eventually fill with Force users of terrifying power, with people who could hear thoughts and move objects with their minds and cut through soldiers like water, the Mandalorians had discovered that there existed a substance their enemies could not simply unmake. You could not think Beskar away, could not reach out with the Force and part it. You had to deal with it as it was asterisk, a physical thing in the physical world, with weight and solidity and rules. This was not, I think, a small thing. There is a kind of security in that, a kind of freedom even, in knowing that you could face certain kinds of power and not simply lose immediately to something you could not understand or counter. The Jedi, when they eventually encountered the Mandalorians thousands of years later, would face warriors whose armor had been refined across that entire span of time, who had learned not just to make Beskar, but to move in it, to fight in it, to understand exactly how its weight and protection could be married to technique and tactics. But the root of it all was that early discovery, a metal that refused to be cut, a substance that said no to the lightsaber before the lightsaber was even invented. As you listen to the subsequent chapters, as we trace the rise of Mandalorian military power and their eventual conflicts with the Jedi Order, it is worth remembering that it began here in the furnaces of a harsh world, with smiths who were solving a practical problem: how to survive, and in doing so, accidentally forged the answer to a question that would not be asked for millennia. The Mandalorians did not set out to defeat the Jedi. They set out to survive on Mandalore. Everything else followed. There is a lesson in that, I think, about how the deepest preparations for conflict often begin as something far simpler. The desire not to be broken, the determination to remain whole, the patient work of making something that will not yield to the pressure of outside forces. They made their armor in the red light of those ancient forges, and in doing so, they made the only answer the galaxy would ever find to the power of the Force. Imagine, if you will, a world that is not kind. Great stretches of ash-white desert under a sky the color of old bone, domed settlements clinging to existence like thoughts too stubborn to fade. The planet is Mandalore, and the people who live there learned early that the land itself would kill you if you gave it the chance, and most of the time, even if you didn't. From that crucible came a culture that understood something the Force users of the galaxy would not grasp for thousands of years. That survival is not a gift granted by destiny or mysticism, but something you build with your own hands, piece by piece, day after day. The Tong were not always Mandalorians. That word did not exist when they first came to this world, gray-skinned and lean, driven across the stars by forces they could not overcome. They had been the warriors of the shadow, as they called themselves in their own language, masters of Coruscant in an age so distant that even the Jedi, with their long view of history, barely remembered it. But the battalions of Gel, human soldiers, organized and relentless, had pushed them out, and the Tong, rather than fade into myth, had chosen to flee and find somewhere new. And they found Mandalore. It was not a gift. One of their number, a warrior whose name has come down to us as Mandalore the First, looked at that hostile world and saw not an ending but a beginning, a place where strength could be tested and refined, where weakness would be culled not by judgment but by the simple mathematics of survival. He unified the scattered Tong clans, and in doing so, he gave them something more valuable than territory. He gave them an identity that was not about where you came from, but about who you chose to become. The name Mandalore meant something in the old Tong tongue. It was a title, a concept of rightful leadership, a promise that the strongest and most capable would lead, and that everyone else would follow because they recognized the truth of that strength. And slowly, over generations, the word that had meant a title began to mean the people themselves. Mandarade, the children of Mandalore, though not all of them were Tong anymore. This is a crucial thing to understand, and I find myself dwelling on it because it is the key to everything that comes later. The Mandalorians were not a species. They were a covenant. You could be born Mandalorian, but you could also become Mandalorian if you embraced the code and submitted to the discipline and wore the armor and spoke the language and answered when the Mandala called your name. It meant that as the Tong population dwindled, as wars took their toll and time wore away at the bloodlines, the culture did not die with them. It transformed. Humans joined the clans. Other species, seeing what the Mandalorians had built, chose to adopt the way and be adopted in turn. The armor remained, the language remained, the code remained, carved into stone so old that no one remembered who had written it. The Rizalnea, the 6 actions, the foundation of everything Mandalorian life meant. Wear your armor, speak the language, defend yourself and your family, raise your children as Mandarade, contribute to your clan's survival, answer when the Mandala calls you to war. It is a simple creed, deceptively so, but simplicity was the point. The Jedi would later build their order on philosophy and meditation and the careful cultivation of spiritual discipline. on the belief that the Force itself would guide those pure enough to listen. The Mandalorians built theirs on something colder and more honest. The understanding that the galaxy was hostile, that no one was coming to save you, and that the only reliable strength was the strength you could forge yourself. As the Crusades began, and here I mean the great waves of Mandalorian expansion across the outer systems, the wars that would carry their banners and their armor from world to world, the culture refined itself further. They learned that conquest was not enough. You had to organize it, systematize it, turn it into something repeatable and teachable. A single warrior, no matter how fierce, could win a battle, but an army had to win a war, and an army required discipline, hierarchy, shared doctrine, and the willingness to follow orders even when you disagreed with them. The clans, the Alliate, as they were called in Mandalore, became the building blocks of something larger. Houses, factions, military structures that could coordinate across star systems. And at the center of it all was the Mandalore, the leader who held the title, and with it, the absolute right to command. What is striking about this, when you hold it up to the light, is how little faith it required. The Jedi believed in the Force. The Mandalorians believed in Beskar, in jetpacks, in tactics, in the person standing next to you who had trained beside you since childhood. They believed in the mythosaur, the great beast that the first Mandalorians had tamed, or so the song said, the creature whose skull became the sigil of the Mandalore, the symbol that you were worthy to lead because you had the strength of that ancient monster behind you. Whether the mythosaurs were still there, or whether they had ever been there at all, seemed almost beside the point. The legend was strong enough, and the metaphor was true enough, and in the end, that was all that mattered. A warrior culture does not ask for your faith in invisible things. It asks you to trust the person next to you, to trust your equipment, to trust your training, and to trust that if you do all three, you will walk away and your enemy will not. As the early expansion age unfolded, this philosophy was tested again and again, refined by combat, sharpened by loss. The Mandalorians fought enemies without number across the galaxy, and with each victory, they became more efficient, more organized, more lethal. They hired themselves out as mercenaries because they loved war and because it paid, but also because mercenary work meant constant exposure to new opponents, new tactics, new ways of thinking about how to kill. A standing army fights the same enemies it has always known. Mercenaries fight everyone, and they learn. And somewhere in the midst of all this, somewhere in the desert wind, and the clanging of Beskar forges, and the roar of thruster jets climbing towards space, the Mandalorians began, almost without noticing it, to become something that no Jedi Knight had ever encountered before. Not a species, not a religion, not even truly a nation in the way the Republic would come to understand that word. A culture of pure, distilled martial excellence, built on a foundation of Beskar and code, and the unshakable belief that in this galaxy, strength was the only law that mattered, and they had made themselves stronger than anyone else could manage. They did not know yet that they were building something that would one day bring the Jedi Order to its knees. But they were building it anyway, one generation at a time, one warrior at a time, one piece of armor at a time. The deserts of Mandalore had taught them well. They had learned the lesson that harsh places always teach, that survival is not a right, it is a skill, and like all skills, it can be honed to perfection. You know, there is a moment in medieval Mandalorian texts, old chronicles written on heat-treated leather, still preserved in the archives of House Vizsla, where a warrior named Kol Vorkari argues against something a scholar had suggested to him about the deeper nature of combat. The scholar had asked whether there might be a mystical dimension to Mandalorian fighting, some inner force or spiritual power that made them effective, the way the old stories spoke of the Jedi. Kol's response was to break down his training method with absolute, almost irritating precision. Stance, angle of approach, weight distribution, reaction time to opponent movement, the exact distance at which a thrown blade would tumble before striking true, the mechanics of why Beskar reflected certain energies, and how to angle armor plates to maximize that reflection. He did not say the scholar was foolish. He simply responded with information, the way you might explain how a lock works to someone asking about the magic that opens doors. There is something in that response that contains almost everything you need to understand about how the Mandalorians thought about themselves and about power. The Jedi built their philosophy on something invisible, the Force, a living energy that surrounded all things, that could be felt and communed with through meditation, that guided the hand of a lightsaber wielder as surely as breath guides a heartbeat. To the Jedi, combat was an extension of spiritual attunement. The better you could feel the Force, the better you could fight. But the Mandalorians did not have the Force, not as a culture, not as an inheritance. And rather than see that as a weakness, they decided to build something else entirely. They built mastery of the concrete world. A Mandalorian warrior did not meditate in a temple to commune with hidden forces. They trained in the red dust of Mandalore's deserts until their reflexes became faster than thought, until the weight of their armor became an extension of their body rather than a burden. They did not seek enlightenment, they sought precision. A Jedi Knight would move with fluidity, guided by Force perception, always sensing the next moment before it came. A Mandalorian warrior would move with calculation, having trained every possible response to every probable threat until the decision-making happened in the body itself, in muscle memory forged through 10,000 repetitions. Different paths to the same goal, the ability to move faster than an enemy could react. But they came from opposite places, rested on opposite assumptions about what the universe was made of. You must understand that this was not something the medieval Mandalorians were inventing specifically to counter the Jedi, even though that would come later. This was how they had always trained, because it was what the harsh world of Mandalore demanded. On a planet where the weather could kill you, where the fauna was engineered to be lethal, where survival meant knowing exactly how much water your body needed and how to ration it, spirituality became a luxury. You could not meditate your way through a dust storm. You could not commune with nature to escape a pack of mythosaurs. You had to know things, practical, concrete, repeatable things, and you had to know them so thoroughly that you could execute them perfectly under stress. It was the difference, perhaps, between building a philosophy on what the world feels like and building one on what the world actually is. And over centuries, as Mandalorian clans expanded outward from their home world and encountered other cultures, other warriors, other ways of fighting, this philosophy only solidified. The Mandala unified the clans not by promising them spiritual transcendence, but by offering them a code, the Rizalnea, the 6 actions, and a promise. If you follow this code, if you train with discipline, if you wear Beskar and stand with your alliate, you will survive. Not mystical survival, not karma or the favor of cosmic forces, but practical survival earned through preparation and precision. A Mandalorian did not believe in luck because belief was irrelevant. You trained so thoroughly that luck became irrelevant. The Jedi made a virtue of detachment, of setting aside emotion and ego to serve a larger Force-guided purpose. There is something noble in that, something that speaks to the best parts of what a warrior can be. But there is also a distance in it, a removal of the self from the equation. The Mandalorians, by contrast, made a virtue of clarity of purpose and absolute accountability for your own choices. You were responsible for your shield and your sword because they were literally in your hands. You were responsible for your clan's survival because you fought alongside them every day, not in abstract service to an invisible force, but in concrete, tangible defense of the people standing next to you. Mandar, the Mandalorian language, was built on this same principle. Every word was practical, functional, shaped for use rather than poetry, though the two sometimes overlapped. When a Mandalorian said, Aliat Orashir Taldin, family is more than blood. They were not making a sentimental claim. They were stating a functional fact about how their society organized itself. A being of any species could become Mandalorian if they could fight, if they would follow the code, if they would put their clan before themselves. That was not poetic sentiment, that was combat mathematics. If you recruit fighters of quality from any world and any species, you multiply your strength by their numbers and their diversity of experience. It was the practical reasoning of a warrior people who had learned through hard centuries that the best strategy beats the best individual warrior every time. In the great chronicles of medieval Mandalore, this principle appears again and again. Never fight alone, never rely on individual genius, always have redundancy in your tactics, always assume your enemy is trying to kill you and plan accordingly. A Jedi Master might trust the Force to guide their lightsaber in an impossible duel. A Mandalorian warrior would never accept a duel they hadn't already planned to win. They would not fight in the arena of their enemy's choosing. They would change the arena entirely, bring their whole aliat, bring numbers and position and equipment designed for the specific opponent, and they would make winning inevitable before the first shot was fired. You can see this in every account of Mandalorian military campaigns during their great expansion era. They did not rely on brilliant generals or inspired moments of heroism. They relied on systematic force deployment, on armor that could withstand sustained punishment, on coordinated squad tactics that meant no single enemy could break their lines, on the principle that a small disciplined force fighting with perfect information about terrain and enemy positions could defeat a much larger force fighting blind. And when they eventually did encounter the Jedi, when the Force users of the Republic finally crossed swords with the armored warriors of Mandalore, something remarkable happened. The Jedi expected that individual mastery, that attunement to the Force, would translate into battlefield dominance. They expected the old equation to hold. One master is worth 1,000 soldiers. But the Mandalorians had built an entire culture precisely to prove that equation wrong. They had spent centuries building the knowledge and the weaponry and the philosophy that would allow them to say, no, one master meets a disciplined squad of 5, and the squad takes the master's life. Not because any of them was stronger than the master individually, but because that was not the equation they had agreed to fight. And I think that is the moment, right there. Not at the Clone Wars, not at the Temple's fall, but centuries earlier in medieval Mandalore, when the outcome of everything that was to come was already written. The Jedi had built a philosophy of individual transcendence. The Mandalorians had built a philosophy of collective precision. When those two things finally collided in open war, there was really only ever going to be one outcome. Let that settle for a moment, and we will move forward. 3,000 years before the Clone Wars, when the Jedi Order had already grown into the peacekeepers of the Republic, a Mandalorian scout named Tor Vizsla encountered his first Force user on the ice fields of a colony world, and something shifted in Mandalorian understanding forever. The scout was not hunting anything mystical that day. He was tracking a target, a human smuggler who had wronged the Mandalore's interests, across a frozen plateau where the cold itself was a weapon. What he found instead was a Jedi Knight standing alone, robes whipping in the wind, and the Knight was there hunting the same smuggler. Now, you have to understand what the Jedi represented to the galaxy at that time. They were already legends, the guardians of an ancient order, said to see all things through the Force, to move with prescience, to be nearly impossible to kill. The Republic's security rested on them. Planetary rulers sought their counsel. And Tor Vizsla, standing on that ice field, knew none of this would save them. What he saw was not a mystic, but a human being standing in a vulnerable position, and his Beskar-armored body moved with the clarity of someone who understood a simple fact. The Force was powerful, but it was not omnipotent. The duel that followed became legend in Mandalorian circles, though it never made it into Jedi records. Tor did not kill the knight. That was never the point of what happened. What mattered was that he fought him to a standstill, his Beskar absorbing lightsaber strikes that should have dismantled his armor, his training and positioning neutralizing the knight's advantages one by one. When the smuggler escaped in the chaos, both warriors let him go, and they stood facing each other across the wind-carved ice. The Jedi Knight, I believe, saw something he did not expect to see, a warrior who could not be broken by the Force. And Tor Vizsla saw something equally profound, a Force user who bled, who tired, who could be outmaneuvered by superior tactical awareness. He returned to Mandalore and did something that would ripple through Mandalorian culture for the next 3,000 years. He told the truth about what he had witnessed. The Force was formidable, he said, but it was not all-powerful. A Jedi Knight could be pressed, pinned, forced into defensive positions by a warrior who understood armor, positioning, and the shape of open ground. He could be tired. He could be wrong. The Jedi Order, from its perspective, did not think this moment was important enough to record in detail. One night, one duel, one inconclusive encounter on an ice field, thousands of light years from the temple. But the Mandalorians understood instantly what it meant. They had been told their entire history that some things in the galaxy were simply stronger, that the Force was the highest measure of power, that their armor and their code were admirable but ultimately secondary to the mysticism of ancient orders. Tor Vizsla had just proven that was a lie. There's something I want to dwell on here, because it sits at the very heart of what makes the Mandalorian-Jedi conflict what it becomes. The Jedi had built their entire order on faith, faith in the living Force, faith in their connection to it, faith that meditation and attunement and the pursuit of enlightenment would keep them safe and wise. And there is genuine strength in that faith. The Jedi were extraordinary warriors precisely because they believed in something larger than themselves, and that belief made them formidable. But the Mandalorians, from their very origins in the hostile deserts of their world, had learned to build strength on what they could touch, measure, and teach. They learned it because they had to. You cannot survive Mandalore by faith alone. You survive by knowing your armor will hold, by trusting the warrior next to you, by understanding the ground beneath your feet. When Tor Vizsla stood on that ice field and looked at the Jedi Knight, what he saw was a warrior whose power came from something invisible, something the Mandalorian could not learn or replicate or hold in his hands. And what he understood in that moment was this: invisible power could be neutralized by visible, tangible discipline. After Tor Vizsla's report, the Mandalorian Crusaders began what was, though they did not yet know it, a 3,000-year project of systematic study. They began to ask questions that the Jedi Order, in its confidence, had never thought to ask about itself. How does a lightsaber move through different materials? What are the limits of Force-enhanced speed when facing a warrior in perfect armor who knows the ground? Can a single Jedi Knight be overwhelmed by coordinated warriors fighting in formation rather than dueling one-on-one? What happens to a Force user's concentration when under sustained assault from multiple angles? These were not mystical questions. They were the practical, methodical questions of a warrior culture that had long ago learned that the only advantage you could trust was the one you could test and refine and pass down to the next generation. The Jedi, in those 3,000 years before the Clone Wars, never truly reckoned with what Tor Vizsla had discovered on that ice field. The Force users of the Republic were confident in their dominion, secure in their role as peacekeepers and guides. Individual encounters with Mandalorian warriors, even victories, did not strike them as significant. But the Mandalorians were not like other enemies the Jedi faced. They did not worship the Force. They did not fear it in the spiritual way that enemies educated in Republic culture feared it. They simply looked at it clearly and thought, "Here is a thing that is formidable, and here is how we will overcome it." That clarity, that refusal to grant the Force any mystery or dominion over Mandalorian thinking, became the defining characteristic of Mandalorian resistance. By the time the Mandalorian Wars would finally come, 3,000 years later, the philosophy that Tor Vizsla planted on that ice field would have matured into complete doctrine. But it started with one scout, one duel, one moment of absolute clarity. The Force was powerful, but it could be resisted, outmaneuvered, and ultimately defeated by a warrior with armor, discipline, and the will to believe in nothing but what he could touch. That belief, once born, never left the Mandalorian people. And the Jedi, for all their mystical power, would spend the rest of their history trying to counter something they had never quite understood, an enemy that simply refused to be awed by them. So far we have spoken of discovery, the finding of Beskar, the building of a code, the first small revelation that the Force was not unbeatable. What we turn to now is something larger, the systematic testing of that revelation, across dozens of worlds, over centuries, until the pattern became undeniable. This is the era of the Great Crusades, when Mandalorian armies moved across the galaxy like a slow tide, and the question that Tor Vizsla had answered on that ice field became the foundation of everything they built. The story begins, as so many Mandalorian stories do, with exile and hunger. The Taung had ruled Coruscant once, or believed they had, which in memory amounts to the same thing. They were a martial people, grey-skinned and lean, built for warfare, the way other species are built for farming or trade. But Coruscant is a crowded world, and crowded worlds eventually turn on those who do not belong, and the Taung found themselves driven outward, pushed to the edges, then pushed beyond them entirely. One of their leaders, a figure the histories call Mandalore I, though his birth name was T. Solik, looked at the stars and made a choice that would echo forward across millennia. Instead of retreating into safety, he would find a world to claim. He found Mandalore, a harsh place in the Outer Rim, a desert world of stone canyons and volcanic heat, where the great beasts called mythosaurs hunted across the dunes. Mandalore I did not negotiate with the planet, he conquered it. The mythosaurs were said to be the size of mountains, armored in scales that no conventional weapon could pierce, intelligent in the way that only the most dangerous predators are intelligent. The story tells that Mandalore hunted one and killed it, and took its skull as the symbol of his rule. I find myself thinking about what that moment must have meant. Not just a triumph, but a declaration that the Taung would survive here, would master this world, would take even its most terrible things and transform them into proof of their dominion. The skull became the sigil of every Mandala who followed. And the Taung, renaming themselves Mandaraid, the children of Mandalore, turned their exile into identity. Now here is what matters for our purposes. The crusades that followed were not wars of passion or desperation, but deliberate campaigns of expansion, methodical and patient. The Mandalorians did not send champions to duel with the Jedi. They sent armies. Coordinated forces of heavy infantry in Beskar armor, squads trained to move as single organisms, each member knowing the precise role they would play. They brought starfighters to worlds where a Jedi might have expected only ground troops. They brought siege weapons, artillery, support personnel. They treated warfare not as a test of virtue, but as a problem to be solved through superior positioning, superior information, and superior numbers applying superior tactics. A single Jedi, however gifted, however attuned to the Force, could not be everywhere on a battlefield at once. A single Jedi could not stop an orbital strike. A single Jedi could not face 30 Beskar-armored warriors, coordinating their assault through comm systems, feinting and pressing, and adjusting their approach in real time based on what they learned from every exchange. Over and over across dozens of worlds, the pattern repeated. Mandalorian armies would arrive, declare their claim, and offer the option of surrender before the assault began. Some worlds accepted, some resisted. When they resisted, the Mandalorians came in force, their combined arms tactics grinding through planetary defenses with mechanical efficiency. And when the Jedi came, and sometimes they did, the Mandalorians did not fear them. There are records of individual Jedi killing dozens of Mandalorian soldiers, sometimes hundreds, in desperate stands throughout the Crusades. But there are no records of a single Jedi stopping a coordinated Mandalorian assault. No accounts of a Force user changing the outcome of a campaign through individual excellence. What you see instead in the historical accounts is something quieter and more unsettling. The Jedi Order, over time, simply stopped engaging the Mandalorians directly. They did not admit defeat, they reframed their role. The Jedi had a responsibility to the Republic, to the people they served. The Mandalorians were mercenaries and conquerors outside the Order's jurisdiction. It is a reasonable argument, actually, and there may have been truth in it. But I think it also reflected a growing understanding that something about the Mandalorian way, the emphasis on armor over mysticism, on squad tactics over individual prowess, on material advantage over spiritual discipline, had found a gap in Jedi philosophy that the Jedi themselves could not quite see. There is something worth sitting with here, because it speaks to what would eventually make the Mandalorians so lethal. The Jedi were trained from childhood to see the Force as the primary tool of their power. Meditation, attunement, the discipline of the mind and spirit, these were the foundations of Jedi strength. They were, by almost any measure, extraordinary warriors, faster than most species could see, capable of feats of strength and perception that seemed almost godlike. But they were also trained in a philosophy that prized individual excellence and direct confrontation. A Jedi wanted to face you in dueling distance, lightsaber to lightsaber, where the Force gave them an absolute advantage. The Mandalorians, by contrast, wanted something different entirely from warfare. They wanted to win, and to win reliably, predictably, across dozens of different worlds against dozens of different enemies. You could not rely on individual genius or mystical power. You built systems. You built doctrine. You built supply lines and communication networks and squad cohesion, so refined that 30 soldiers could move together with the coordination of a single mind. You designed encounters where your soldiers had every advantage. The high ground, numbers, flanking positions, suppressing fire, and armor that could withstand almost anything thrown at it. If your opponent was stronger or faster, you ensured they never got close enough for strength or speed to matter. And if they did somehow close the distance, you had 4 more soldiers right there, and 3 more behind them, and a gunship overhead, and reserves waiting in the landing craft. The Jedi philosophy was, I am strong enough to overcome. The Mandalorian philosophy was, I have organized circumstances so thoroughly that strength is irrelevant. Over centuries, across the Crusades, the Mandalorians tested this philosophy against every kind of opponent, and it proved sound. They did not defeat the Jedi, not in the Crusades, not yet. But they learned with each campaign that the Jedi could be contained, managed, neutralized through sheer tactical discipline. And that knowledge, that certainty, became encoded into Mandalorian culture in a way that the Jedi Order, secure in their own confidence, never quite reciprocated. The Mandalorians of the Crusade era did not see the Jedi as an impossible obstacle. They saw them as the ultimate test of their methods, and a test they were passing slowly and steadily across the stars. When you hold that understanding, you begin to see the long shadow of the future already falling across these ancient battlefields. The seeds of everything that would come, the wars, the hunts, the systematic destruction of the Jedi Order itself, were already being planted here, in the careful, patient, methodical way Mandalorian armies learn to wage war against Force users and win. That is not a small thing. That is the foundation on which all that follows is built. Before we speak of the moment Mandalore, the ultimate, declared war on the Republic, you need to understand something about patience and inevitability. For 3,000 years, the Mandalorians had known what the Jedi did not, that the Force was not destiny, that armor and training could answer it, that a warrior with discipline could stand against a Jedi and live. That knowledge had been turning in their culture like a seed buried in rich soil, growing quietly through the Great Crusades, through the consolidation of clans, through 10 generations of smiths perfecting Beskar forges, and 10 generations of warriors teaching their sons how to move when facing someone who could see the future. Then, around the year 3976 of the Before Yavin calendar, Mandalore, the ultimate, looked at the Galactic Republic and saw something the Jedi had begun to believe in their own mythology they were immune to: vulnerability. He had spent years gathering the scattered Mandalorian clans back under one banner, reorganizing them from the old way of honorable chaos into something new, something he called the Neo-Crusaders. This was not merely a rebranding, it was a revolution in Mandalorian military structure. Where the old Crusaders had fought with brilliant individuality, trusting in the skill and honor of each commander, Mandalore the Ultimate imposed standardization. Identical armor specifications, unified doctrine, coordinated strategy flowing down from a single point of command. The Beskar was the same as it had always been, but now it was worn by warriors drilled to move as one organism rather than a confederation of brilliant swordsmen. And I think that is the moment you have to understand as the true threshold. Not the declaration of war itself, but the realization that Mandalorian strength could be systematized, that what made them lethal in single combat could be multiplied across thousands of warriors without losing its edge. What drew Mandalore the Ultimate to declare open war remains, even now, a question with layers underneath it. The Republic had grown soft in prosperity, sprawled across 1,000 worlds, its military stretched thin, maintaining order rather than preparing for invasion. The Jedi Council, grown comfortable in their philosophy that the Force would provide, had counseled restraint and patience, refusing to commit the order to direct military intervention on the Republic's behalf. Mandalore the Ultimate saw an opening that might have been 100 years coming. But there was also something else moving in the shadows, something that would not become clear until much later. The Sith in those years wore the faces of Jedi, two knights named Revan and Malak who were beginning their long, patient work of probing the Republic's defenses, testing its will to resist, understanding where it was weakest. They encouraged Mandalore, the Ultimate, toward war not because they wanted him to win, but because they wanted to see what breaking him would teach them about how to break the Jedi Order itself. This is perhaps the most painful detail in all of this history, that the Mandalorians, who had spent millennia preparing to face the Jedi through their own genius and discipline, were being used as an instrument of calculation by powers they did not perceive. Even so, Mandalore the Ultimate did not declare war because someone whispered in his ear. He declared war because he had built something that worked, something that he had tested and refined and knew could answer the Jedi's lightsabers and their meditation and their talk of the will of the Force. The raids began along the Outer Rim, systematic probes against worlds that mattered, but not so much that the Republic could not afford to hesitate in response. Cathar fell, and the Mandalorians' response to that world became known afterward as an atrocity, a moment when the discipline of the Neo-Crusaders hardened into something that was not merely military efficiency, but cruelty for its own sake. Other worlds followed. Vanquo Suaja, places whose names are remembered in historical texts, but whose burning is remembered in the grieving of families who lost everything in the certainty that the Republic would not send its protectors to save them. And the Republic did not. The Jedi Council, under voices like Vruk Lamar and the revered Master Vandar Tokya, counseled caution, meditation, faith that the Force would guide them to the right moment and the right action. This patience, This philosophy that had served the Jedi so well for millennia became, in that moment, a form of paralysis. There is something almost tragic in it, watching it happen from this distance. The Jedi were not wrong, precisely, to believe that meditation and attunement to the Force led to wisdom. But they had built their entire civilization around the assumption that wisdom would move quickly enough to matter. And in the face of an enemy who had spent 3,000 years preparing simply to prove that assumption was fragile, they discovered too late that it was not. It was a young Jedi Knight named Revan who broke ranks first, who looked at the maps and the casualty reports and the list of worlds that would fall if the Council's caution was allowed to stand, and said, "No, this cannot be endured. We will not wait for the Force to grant us permission." He gathered followers, Jedi who shared his conviction that sometimes the right action was to move, to fight, to answer force with force rather than meditate on the nature of conflict. They became known as the Revanchists, and their willingness to defy the Council's wisdom would eventually prove both their salvation and the seed of their ultimate destruction. But in those first years, when Mandalore the Ultimate's Neo-Crusaders swept across the Rim, the Revanchists were the only Jedi who seemed to understand what was happening. That you could not meditate against an enemy who was willing to burn worlds. That philosophy mattered less than presence, and that sometimes the universe required you to meet steel with steel. What the Mandalorian Wars revealed then was not that the Jedi were weak, precisely, but that their strength was built on assumptions that could be questioned, challenged, and eventually broken if someone was patient enough and disciplined enough and willing to spend 3,000 years proving that the Force was not the final word in conflict. Mandalore the Ultimate did not win his war. His ultimate fate at Malacha V would teach him that much. But he won something more lasting, something that echoed through every century that followed. He proved, beyond doubt, before witnesses and history, that the Jedi could be made to move only when they were desperate, that the Council's wisdom could become a form of paralysis, and that a warrior who trusted in armor and numbers and doctrine could force the greatest Force users in the galaxy to abandon their principles and fight his way or face extinction. That, I think, is the true victory he handed down to every Mandalorian who came after him. Not the battles won or the worlds conquered, but the knowledge that the Jedi were not inevitable, merely difficult. And that made all the difference. There comes a moment in a long war when the greatest soldier on one side realizes that everything they have been taught no longer fits the world they are fighting in. Revan was a Jedi Knight, trained in the temple, devoted to the Order's way, meditation, restraint, faith in the Force to guide his hand and reveal the path forward. But by the time the Mandalorian Wars were 3 years old, he had come to understand something the Council, sitting safely in their halls on Coruscant, could not yet see. The Mandalorians were not a puzzle the Jedi philosophy could solve. The Council, under Vrook, Lamar and others, had urged caution, counseled patience, promised that Republic forces would hold without committing the full weight of the Jedi Order to direct combat. Revan watched from the edge of Republic space as world after world fell to the Neo-Crusaders, as Mandalore the Ultimate's forces, unified, armored, methodical, swept across the outer rim like a blade through silk. He saw the Cathar burned, not in moments of heated battle, but in systematic conquest, and something in the young Jedi Knight broke with the logic of the Council's restraint. So he defied them. He gathered other Jedi, those the Order had not yet broken to patience, those who still believed that action was a form of faith, and he went to war. This was called the Revanchists, this faction that would not wait, and Malak, Revan's closest companion and fellow Jedi, walked that path with him into the darkness, without yet understanding it was a darkness at all. What Revan discovered in the field, commanding Republic forces against the Mandalorians, was both simpler and more terrible than he had imagined. The Mandalorians had spent 3,000 years learning how to kill Jedi, and they had turned that knowledge into doctrine. Beskar armor that would not break, squad tactics that turned numerical advantage into inevitability, positioning that made individual mastery irrelevant. They did not rely on faith or the invisible currents of the Force. They relied on training, on coordination, on equipment, on the certainty that a small force of disciplined soldiers with perfect information could defeat larger forces fighting blind. Revan, for the first time in his life, encountered an enemy that could not be overcome by the gifts the Force had given him. So he did what the Jedi philosophy had always forbidden. He abandoned the certainties he had been taught and borrowed the certainties that the Mandalorians possessed. He studied their tactics, their armor, their doctrine of aggression and calculation. He embraced unconventional strategy, brutality when it served the objective, and the understanding that sometimes the compassionate choice was not to hesitate, but to strike with overwhelming force and end the war before more worlds burned. The Jedi who warned him, and there were Jedi who warned him, spoke of the danger inherent in this path, of how the pursuit of victory could shadow the soul and lead a warrior toward the dark side. Revan heard them and continued anyway, because stopping meant watching more people die. By the measure of traditional Jedi virtue, this was a fall. By the measure of military necessity, it was clarity. The thing that haunts me about this moment, when I find myself turning it over in my mind, is that Revan was right. The Mandalorians could not be defeated through meditation and faith in the Force's guidance. They could only be defeated by someone willing to think like a Mandalorian, fight like a Mandalorian, and accept that victory sometimes required becoming the very thing you fought against. Revan rose to supreme command of the Republic forces, and he pressed the war with a ferocity that, in retrospect, should have signaled to the Council what was happening to him. But the Council was not watching, not truly, not until it was far too late. The final blow came at Malach V, a fortress world that had become the heart of Mandalorian resistance. Revan brought a superweapon, the Mass Shadow Generator, a device of such devastating power that it did not simply destroy the Mandalorian stronghold. It obliterated everything on the surface, both the enemy and the Republic forces stationed there, soldiers who had followed Revan's orders into the fire. Mitra Surik, a Jedi general serving under Revan's command, gave the final order that activated the weapon, and in that moment, the Mandalorian Wars ended not with the triumph the Republic had sought, but with something closer to mutual ruin. Mandalore the Ultimate fell to Revan, and Revan took his mask, that symbol of leadership, that artifact of 3,000 years of Mandalorian philosophy, as a trophy or perhaps as a confession of what he had become. The Mandalorian clans, unified by Mandalore the Ultimate, scattered in the aftermath, leaderless and broken. The Republic had won, in the most technical and hollow sense. But Revan had changed in the winning. The Jedi who had gone to war against the Council's wishes, who had absorbed Mandalorian ferocity into his own practice, who had authorized the annihilation of Malach V. This Revan was no longer the young knight who had defied Coruscant out of compassion for the Republic's dying worlds. He was something else now, something harder, something that the Mandalorians had helped shape even in their defeat. When he and Malak disappeared into the unknown regions after the war, they returned as something the galaxy had never seen before. Sith Lords, trained in the philosophy of power and domination rather than peace and harmony. Darth Revan and Darth Malak emerged from the darkness as if transformed by it, though I suspect the transformation had begun long before. In the moment, Revan decided that defeating the Mandalorians required becoming like them. There is a profound and painful irony woven through these events, and it is one I keep coming back to when I think about why the Mandalorians proved so lethal to Jedi philosophy. The Jedi philosophy could not defeat the Mandalorians because it was incomplete. It prized individual excellence and faith in forces beyond sight, and those things are real and powerful, but they are not enough against an enemy who has built their entire culture around making those gifts irrelevant. So the greatest Jedi of his generation had to become something other than what the Jedi had taught him to be. He had to stop trusting in the Force and start trusting in armor, strategy, and the willingness to pay any price for victory. He had to become, in spirit if not in name, a Mandalorian. And in becoming that, he fell from the light into darkness, the very thing the Council had warned about when they counseled caution. The Mandalorians, in the end, did not need to defeat Revan. They only needed to be real and uncompromising enough that Revan would have to sacrifice the parts of himself that made him Jedi in order to survive against them. They only needed to exist exactly as they were and let the logic of victory do the rest. That is a kind of power that the Jedi, for all their training and attunement to the Force, were not prepared for. On a jungle moon called Dizan, in the long shadow of the Mandalorian Wars, the last organized stronghold of the Neo-Crusaders made their stand, and what happened there would reshape how both sides understood the cost of fighting each other. Dizan orbits Onderon in the Outer Rim, a place so thick with jungle and so alive with predators that the Mandalorians chose it not for comfort, but for defensibility, dense enough to hide an army, hostile enough that even the jungle fought alongside them. When Mandalore the Ultimate fell at Malacha V, killed by Revan's hand, the Neo-Crusader fleet was shattered by the mass shadow generator, a weapon that didn't discriminate between soldier and leader, between those who surrendered and those who fought to the last breath. But not all of them died on that ruined world. Some escaped into hyperspace with fragments of fleets, with armor intact, and the knowledge that the Jedi had beaten them not through superior combat, but through superior desperation. They retreated to Dizan, to fortified positions in the jungle, where the dense canopy made orbital bombardment uncertain, and the predators of the moon would exact a cost from any ground assault. And there, in 3956 BBY, they waited, not for victory, because that had become impossible, but for something less grand and somehow more important. A chance to prove that the Mandalorian way could not be broken, only scattered. The survivors who held Dizan were led by Canderous Ordo, a warrior of Clan Ordo who had fought through the entire Mandalorian Wars and knew, better than most, the precise measure of what they had lost and what remained worth defending. Canderous was not Mandalore the Ultimate. That title had died with his predecessor, the mask lost somewhere in the wreckage of Malacha V, beyond recovery or sight. But Canderous carried something that Mandalore had possessed and lost, clarity about what the Mandalorians actually were, beneath the grand ambitions of conquest and the 3,000-year philosophy that had driven them toward the Jedi. They were warriors who took care of their own, who understood that the smallest unit of survival was the alliate, the clan, and that no grand vision mattered if the person next to you fell and you were not there to catch them. The Jedi who came to Dizan came as victors, and they came with something the Mandalorians had never fully accounted for, the exhaustion of having won a war. Victory in the Mandalorian Wars had hollowed something out inside the Jedi Order itself, had forced them to choose between their philosophy and their survival, and that choice had changed them in ways they were still learning to live with. I think about this often, the way that defeating an enemy sometimes costs you more than losing would have. The Mandalorians had proven something over the course of the wars that the Jedi could not unknow, that the Force was not sufficient, that armor and training and perfect unit cohesion could match a lightsaber, that the comfortable assumption of Jedi superiority was an assumption rather than a law. And the Jedi, in proving they could beat the Mandalorians, had proven it only by ceasing to be quite what they had been before. On Dizan, in the rain-thick jungle with the sounds of predators beyond the perimeter and the weight of the war settling into the bones of every soldier, Canderous Ordo faced a simple choice. Fight to the end and let the Mandalorians go extinct as a military force or something else. What he chose, quietly and without announcing it as philosophy, was to let the vision of Mandalore the Ultimate go. The grand conquest would not happen. The 3,000-year march toward proving the Jedi beatable had accomplished exactly that It had proven them beatable, but it had not conquered them. What Canderous chose instead was to hold what remained, to keep alive the knowledge of how to forge Beskar, to maintain the Risolnir not as a doctrine of expansion, but as a code of survival, to gather Mandalorians not around conquest, but around the simple fact of Mandalorian identity. In doing this, he may have saved them more completely than victory would have. The attrition warfare that followed on Dizan had no grand narrative. There were no legendary final stands, no moments of individual heroism that songs would later memorialize. There was only the slow, grinding process of two militaries learning to coexist in a stalemate, of Jedi Knights discovering that holding a jungle moon against an enemy that understood jungle warfare, as well as any Jedi understood the Force, was not a matter of ideology or training. It was a matter of logistics and patience and accepting losses. The Mandalorians learned from the Jedi presence on Dizan and around Onderon. They learned gaps in Jedi doctrine that centuries of assumption had left unexamined, blind spots created by the confidence that Force attunement was enough. The Jedi learned that the Mandalorians, even scattered and leaderless, even holding only a defensive position on a demon moon, were not a problem that could be solved permanently, only managed, monitored, allowed to exist in a state of careful stalemate. There's something in that outcome that feels important to sit with. The Mandalorian Wars had been framed as a test. Would the Jedi be able to answer an enemy that had spent 3,000 years learning to counter them? The answer, as Revan had proven at Malach-Avi, was yes, they could, but only at a cost that changed them fundamentally. What the fall of Dizan, the non-fall, the stalemate, revealed was something quieter and perhaps more durable. That after the grand narrative ended, after the wars were officially concluded, the fundamental tension remained. The Mandalorians and the Jedi would never actually resolve which philosophy was superior, because both had been forged in fire, and both had survived the furnace transformed. Canderous Ordo, holding the jungle moon with whatever Mandalorian remnants he could gather, was not defeated. He was only displaced, scattered, reduced to a fraction of what the Neo-Crusaders had been. But he was also, in a way, freer than he had ever been. The weight of Mandalore, the Ultimate's ambitions, the pressure of a 3,000-year philosophy demanding victory, the obligation to prove superiority through conquest, all of that had been burned away at Malach-Avi. What remained was something simpler and, I think, more fundamentally Mandalorian. The resolve to survive, to maintain the knowledge, to pass the armor and the code to the next generation, and to never, ever forget how to kill a Force user. The Dizan stronghold held, and then slowly it transformed into something different. Not a military base in an active war, but a refuge, a place where Mandalorian culture could continue, diminished but unbroken, until a day that none of them could foresee when the galaxy would have need of what they were. In that waiting, in that patient, quiet endurance, the Mandalorians discovered something the wars had not taught them. That outlasting an enemy was, in its own way, a form of victory that no conqueror would ever fully understand. In the quiet years after Malach-Avi, when the wars had ended and the dust had finally settled on what remained of Mandalorian ambition, the survivors had time at last to understand what had truly defeated them. It was not the mass shadow generator, though that weapon had certainly killed them by the thousands. It was not Revan himself, though he had proven formidable enough to force the Mandalorians to reckon with an enemy who understood them. It was, in the end, a single undeniable fact. One Jedi Knight alone could be beaten by a Mandalorian squad. But the Republic did not field one Jedi Knight. The Clone Wars had not yet come. There was no vast army of Jedi commanders stretching across 1,000 worlds. But even so, the Jedi Order numbered in the thousands, and they had learned, by necessity, how to coordinate. What the Mandalorians discovered in those years of grinding war was that their greatest strength, The doctrinal certainty that squad tactics and Beskar armor could overcome individual Force users became a liability the moment they had to face those Force users in number. A Mandalorian squad, perfectly trained and coordinated, could kill a single Jedi. They had proven this again and again across the Mandalorian Wars. But 10 squads could not reliably kill 10 Jedi separated and spread across a battlefield, each one commanding their own portion of the field and calling down starfighters and artillery on coordinated Mandalorian positions. There was an asymmetry that the Mandalorians had never truly had to face before, and it was rooted in something far deeper than tactics or armor. You see, the Mandalorian philosophy had been built on a principle that discipline and preparation could eliminate surprise, that perfect information and superior positioning could beat genius, that a coordinated force with clear purpose would defeat a larger force fighting blind. This had been true, absolutely true, across 3,000 years of Mandalorian military history. But the Jedi did not fight blind. They fought with a resource the Mandalorians could not match, the Force itself, which gave them awareness that no tactical preparation could fully counter. A Jedi commander in one part of a battlefield could sense, genuinely sense, through the Force, what was happening in distant sectors, could feel the intentions of enemies through the fabric of the living galaxy itself. No amount of encryption or misdirection could truly hide a Mandalorian squad's presence from a trained Jedi. The Mandalorians had learned to mitigate this advantage through discipline and doctrine, but they could not eliminate it. And that was the deeper lesson of the Mandalorian Wars, the one that the pragmatic survivors like Canderous Ordo carried with them into the long silence that followed. Asymmetric warfare worked only when both sides had comparable resources. A Mandalorian squad versus a lone Jedi was not asymmetric. It was a Mandalorian squad with armor and discipline facing a Jedi with armor and discipline and access to forces that transcended physical space. There is something I keep thinking about in this context, and I wonder if you felt it too. We tend to imagine warfare as a problem to be solved through cleverness and preparation, which is very much the Mandalorian assumption. But the Jedi possessed something that made cleverness only partially relevant. They could not be wholly surprised. They could not be wholly cut off from information. A single Jedi Knight could sense an ambush before it was sprung. A single Jedi could feel the moment a Mandalorian squad decided to strike. This was not a flaw in Mandalorian tactics. It was evidence that some problems cannot be solved through tactics alone. And yet, and this is where the real insight lives, a single Jedi could only be in one place at one time. The weakness of the Jedi Order, the blind spot that would eventually kill them, was that they were fundamentally organized around the assumption of the exceptional individual. A Jedi Master could command a sector because it was assumed that one Jedi Master, properly positioned, with proper support, could handle the Force-related challenges that came his way. But what happened when the Mandalorians arrived in numbers, in coordinated units, each squad specifically trained not to defeat Jedi in single combat, but to overwhelm them through superior positioning and crossfire from angles a lightsaber could not defend against simultaneously? What happened was that the Jedi discovered, slowly and painfully, that their philosophy scaled poorly. 10 Jedi Masters spread across a sector could each beat a Mandalorian squad, but they could not beat 10 Mandalorian squads arriving in coordinated waves, because the Mandalorians were not trying to beat Jedi. They were trying to kill soldiers. And soldiers could be killed by crossfire, by coordinated blaster fire from multiple angles, by jetpack strikes from above, by concussive grenades that disrupted a Jedi's balance, by flamethrowers and poison, and 100 other practical solutions to the problem of a warrior in armor with a lightsaber. This is what the Mandalorians had refined across 3,000 years, ever since Tor Vizsla had fought that Jedi on the ice field and returned with a revelation. The Force was not omnipotent, merely powerful. and powerful could be managed. It could be countered. It could be overwhelmed through discipline and numbers, and the studied art of placing enemies in circumstance where their individual strength became irrelevant. But only if you had enough squads, enough coordinated units, enough armor and training across the whole of your force. The moment the conflict extended beyond the Neo-Crusaders, the moment it became not just Mandalore the Ultimate's personal war, but the Republic's war, the Republic's resources, the Republic's many Jedi, the Mandalorian doctrine that had proven so devastatingly effective against isolated Force users became a liability. You cannot use asymmetric warfare effectively against an enemy with greater overall resources. The Mandalorians had spent 3,000 years perfecting a solution to a narrow problem: how a small, elite, perfectly coordinated force could kill a Force user. But the Jedi Order was not a small problem. It was the largest, Force-sensitive military institution the galaxy had ever known. And by the time the Mandalorians understood this fully, it was too late. The Mandalorian Wars had already burned themselves out. In the long quiet that followed, in those years after Canderous Ordo held Dizun and then let it go, the Mandalorians carried forward not a strategy for victory, but a philosophy of survival. Remember that the Jedi can be killed. Remember the armor. Remember the squads. Remember the discipline. And trust that one day, in circumstances where the numbers favored a different kind of warfare, this knowledge would matter again. And they were right. Because the moment would come, but it would take another 3,000 years, and an enemy far more patient and far more terrible than Mandalore the Ultimate to make it happen. After Malacha V, after Mandalore the Ultimate fell and his mask passed to new hands, the Mandalorians began a long retreat, not a flight, but a withdrawal, deliberate and measured, into the margins of the galaxy where empires rarely looked closely. For nearly 3,000 years after that defeat, they would largely disappear from the histories that mattered, the grand narratives of Jedi and Sith, and the great movements of the Republic. But disappearing from history is not the same as disappearing, and the silence that followed was, I think, far more significant than any of the wars that came before it. What happened in those centuries was quieter than conquest, but in its way it was far more important. The survivors, Canderous Ordo among them, men and women who had fought at Dizun and Malacha, who had held ground against Jedi and lived. These people understood something that the great Mandalas before them had not fully grasped. Victory, they understood now, was not the point. Survival was. Preservation was. The Mandalorians had spent 3,000 years learning how to kill Force users, refining that knowledge through generation after generation of encounter, testing, warfare, and loss. That knowledge was real, and it was useful, and it had been proven on 100 worlds. But the Jedi Order had resources and reach that no single Mandalorian army could match indefinitely, and the Force itself, still, after all those centuries, remained something that eluded complete solution. So instead of trying to conquer, the survivors made a different choice. They scattered into the Outer Rim, into the Mandalore sector and beyond it, breaking into independent clans and taking work as mercenaries, bounty hunters, soldiers for hire, positions that were beneath the old Mandala's ambitions but perfectly suited to keeping the old knowledge alive. A clan here, a family there, each one maintaining the forgecraft of Beskar, each one teaching the children the design of jetpack and flamethrower, each one preserving the tactical doctrines that had held Jedi at bay. It is a quieter kind of victory than conquest ever was. Over the centuries that followed, the galaxy saw rise and fall of empires that never knew the Mandalorians as a unified threat, because the Mandalorians had chosen not to be unified in that way anymore. The Sith returned, resurgent, and some Mandalorian clans took contracts with them, found employment in their wars against the Jedi and the Republic. Mandalore the Lesser, a figure now largely lost to us, except in fragments and echoes, led forces that fought alongside the Sith Empire in what history calls the Great Galactic War. The Mandalorians did not conquer worlds in their own name anymore. They conquered them on someone else's banner, took their payment, and returned to their own territories with their own purposes intact. You understand what they were doing, I think, even if they did not always articulate it this way themselves. They were not trying to win the galaxy. They were trying to ensure that the knowledge of how to kill a Force user would not be lost, that the technique would not fade into legend and myth, that when the time came, and somewhere in the deep structure of Mandalorian culture, there was a certainty that such a time would come, they would be ready. This is perhaps the strangest thing about the Age of Silence. It was not silent at all in the way that matters. The forges on Mandalore burned constantly, Beskar being worked by hands that had learned the trade from fathers and mothers who had learned it from their fathers and mothers. Young warriors trained in methods refined over millennia, not as preparation for some hoped-for grand conflict, but as a fundamental part of being Mandarayed, children of Mandalore. The jetpacks were maintained, improved, redesigned with small innovations that accumulated across generations. The tactics were taught not as ancient history, but as living knowledge, as relevant as the day they were first developed. In the new Sith Wars, a period of chaos and fragmentation that raged across the galaxy for centuries, the Mandalorians remained largely apart, hiring themselves out to whoever could pay, accumulating wealth and reputation, and most importantly, watching. They watched the Jedi and the Sith tear at each other, watched the destructive reach of Force users, and the vulnerability that came from their reliance on mystical power. They watched the patterns repeat. A Sith Lord would rise, supremely confident in their mastery of dark side power, and would eventually fall, sometimes to another Force user, sometimes to circumstances, sometimes to a blade in the dark. And the Mandalorians, each clan operating independently, but connected by culture and code, noted all of this. There is something I keep thinking about in these quiet centuries, something that lives in the space between what the Mandalorians did and why they did it. They had been defeated, comprehensively, at Malacha V. An entire civilization's ambition for conquest had been destroyed in a single moment, annihilated literally, the planet torn apart by gravitational force, the fleet shattered, the dream of Mandalorian dominance over the galaxy extinguished. By any reasonable measure, they should have been broken, scattered beyond recovery, their culture diluted and absorbed into the greater movements of the galaxy. Instead, they did something stranger. They chose to become invisible while remaining themselves. They became exceptional soldiers for hire, but never for so long or on such grand a scale that they ceased to be Mandalorian. They worked for the Sith and the Jedi and the crime lords and the Republic, taking credits and experience and contracts, but always, they came home to Mandalore and their clans, where the true knowledge was kept. That is a kind of victory that does not announce itself, that requires patience and faith in something other than immediate success. It is, I think, a more profound kind of victory than conquest ever was, because it assumes that you will still be standing long after your enemies have fallen. And that is exactly what would happen. In the silence, in the centuries of apparent decline and fragmentation, the Mandalorians were doing something that the Jedi, confident and secure in their order, their connection to the Force, their place at the center of galactic civilization, were not doing. They were remembering. They were teaching. They were waiting. And they were building, one clan at a time, one warrior at a time, the foundation for a moment when their knowledge would once again be desperately, perfectly, exactly what the galaxy would need. The irony, and it is profound, is that the Jedi never understood what the Mandalorians understood, that the way to defeat an enemy is sometimes not to fight them when they are strong, but to outlast them, to preserve yourself across the centuries until the moment comes when you are exactly what circumstances require. 3,000 years of silence, and the Mandalorians remained Mandarayed. The armor was still Beskar. The code was still the Rizalnea. And the knowledge of how to kill a Force user was no longer a secret preserved by the Great Crusades, but something woven into the very fabric of Mandalorian identity, taught to children as naturally as a mother teaches her child to walk. That, in the end, is what outlasted everything. 100 years before the Clone Wars, Mandalore was a planet at war with itself, and the war was happening in silence. On the surface, the Mandalorians had chosen peace, or had peace chosen for them. It depends on who was telling the story. The great wars that Canderous Ordo had fought on Dizan had ended decades before, and the Mandalorian civil wars that followed had been even more bitter, clan against clan, until the planet itself lay glassed and broken, its surface transformed into great mirrors of fused sand and scorched earth. When the survivors emerged from what remained of their cities, they made a choice that rippled across generations. They would not rebuild as warriors, but as something else entirely. The new Mandalorians, as they came to be called, rejected the old ways, the endless crusades, the pursuit of conquest, the philosophy that a Mandalorian's worth was measured in combat skill and Beskar armor. They built domed cities, most famously Sundari, carefully enclosed against the hostile world outside. And within those domes, they constructed a civilization that tried to be something Mandalore had never been before: peaceful. There is something almost heartbreaking about that choice, when you sit with it long enough. It says that even the most warrior-hearted culture, when it looks at the scars of its own savagery, sometimes flinches. The old songs stopped being sung in the bright halls of Sundari, or if they were, it was quietly, the way you might remember something you've resolved to forget. But there were Mandalorians who could not accept this. There were those who believed that peace was not a worthy end for a people forged in armor and hardship, that something essential, something that had taken 3,000 years to build, was being erased. Among them was a man named Tor Vizsla, a traditionalist who saw the new direction not as healing, but as a kind of death. Tor came from a house with history, House Vizsla, which had once produced a warrior so gifted that he had been invited into the Jedi Order itself, Tar Vizsla, centuries before. When Tar died, the Jedi had kept his lightsaber, but House Vizsla had not forgotten what it represented, that a Mandalorian could master even the Force itself, that the gap between a warrior in Beskar and a Jedi was not unbridgeable. The Darksaber, they called it, a black blade forged by Jedi techniques, but carried by Mandalorian hands, a physical reminder that their people had stood equal to the Force users once. Tor Vizsla understood what that blade meant. He understood that in allowing the domed cities to rise, in accepting pacifism, in moving away from the knowledge that had been so carefully preserved and passed down, the Mandalorians were abandoning not just their past, but their future. So Tor gathered those who felt as he did, those for whom the old ways were not nostalgia, but necessity. He called the faction Kautsad in the old Mandor Death Watch, a name that was both literal and symbolic, a claim that Mandalorian identity itself was dying and that they were its vigil. Death Watch was not large at first, and it had no military power that could challenge the authority of the new Mandalorian government. But it had something perhaps more durable. It had memory. In secret forged temples hidden in the canyons of Mandalore and in the settlements across the Outer Rim, Death Watch preserved what the domed cities wanted to forget. They kept alive the old forging techniques for Beskar, the deep language of combat, the philosophical insistence that a Mandalorian's honor was inseparable from armor and weaponry. They maintained the equipment of the ancient warrior clans, jetpacks and targeting systems, vibroblades and projectile weapons, all the tools of the Mandalorian way. When young Mandalorians from the new generation began to feel the weight of pacifism, to sense that something vital was missing from a culture defined only by its rejection of violence, Death Watch was there to teach them what had been lost. I think this is worth dwelling on, because it reveals something important about how resistance moves through time. The Jedi Order had been defeated at Malachavi by Revan, who had learned to think like a Mandalorian, aggressively, tactically, without the confidence that the Force would provide the answer. But the Mandalorians themselves had learned something harder, that you cannot win against the Jedi Order through conquest, that the Order has resources and reach that scatter any frontal assault. So instead of trying to match the Jedi blow for blow, they learned to outlast them by outliving them, by keeping alive, across centuries, the knowledge of how Force users could be killed. Tor Vizsla and Death Watch were not planning an immediate war. They were keeping a library in the form of armor and doctrine and uncompromising principle, a library that waited for circumstances to change. They wore their traditional armor in a world that was trying to shed such things, spoke the old language in a time of cultural fracture, maintained weapons in an era that wanted to believe weapons were obsolete. Every young Mandalorian who joined them was another thread in a continuity that refused to break. The pacifists of Sundari did not see Death Watch as a serious threat. They were a faction of traditionalists, backward-looking, nostalgic, a cultural rearguard that would eventually fade as the new generation grew up never knowing the old ways. But the new Mandalorians misunderstood what they were facing. They assumed that culture moved in one direction, that once you had chosen peace, you would not slip back into war, that ideas, once discarded, stayed discarded. They did not account for the fact that Tor Vizsla and those like him were not trying to recreate the past, but to preserve it, to hold it in stasis, intact and uncorroded, waiting. And they did not understand that in 3,000 years of warfare against the Jedi, the Mandalorians had learned one thing above all others, that patience itself could be a weapon. So Death Watch waited, in the canyons and the shadows, maintaining their traditions, forging their beskar, teaching the young how to wear armor with the weight it deserved. 100 years before the Clone Wars, this was the quiet fracture in Mandalorian society, not yet violent, not yet visible to the galaxy at large, but present, insistent, impossible to ignore if you knew where to look. The new Mandalorians had chosen a future, and Death Watch had chosen to remember a past. Both groups were equally Mandalorian, equally committed to their vision of what their people should be. The conflict between them would not fully ignite until the Clone Wars drew near, but it was already written in the armor they wore, the languages they spoke, and the unspoken disagreement about whether the greatest warrior culture in the galaxy could ever truly choose to be something else. As the Clone Wars began on Geonosis in 22 BBY, the Republic discovered something curious in the genetic template they had commissioned for their new army. The man's name was Jango Fett, and he wore Mandalorian armor. Jango Fett was a bounty hunter, a hired killer moving through the underworld's margins, and he represented something the Republic had not anticipated, that the warrior traditions of Mandalore, dormant for 3,000 years, had survived in the bodies and choices of individual men. The irony, one I find myself returning to often, is that the Republic believed it had solved its problem by copying Jango's DNA 1,000,000 times over, creating an army of soldiers who could think like a warrior who understood Mandalorian tactics. What they had actually done was ensure that Mandalorian philosophy would train every soldier who carried a blaster in the Clone Wars. Jango died at Geonosis, struck down by Mace Windu, beheaded, in fact, a clean and final death, but his legacy did not die with him. He left behind an unaltered clone, Boba Fett, who would grow to manhood in the shadow of his father's reputation and armor. And he left behind 1,000,000 soldiers, each carrying in their muscle memory and instinctive understanding something Mandalore had learned 3,000 years ago, that the Jedi were not invincible, only difficult. While the clone army marched across the galaxy, Mandalore itself became a stage for a different kind of conflict, one that had less to do with the Republic's war and everything to do with what the Mandalorians themselves believed their future should be. Duchess Satine cries, who ruled Mandalore from the capital city of Sundari, had chosen pacifism, a renunciation so complete that it had transformed her world's entire culture, sealed away in domed cities, away from the warrior traditions that had defined Mandalorian identity for millennia. I understand why she made that choice. I think anyone who lived through the Mandalorian Wars would have understood it. 3,000 years of cultural memory had been devoted to learning how to kill Jedi, and all that knowledge had led to Malacha V, to annihilation, to the understanding that the Jedi as a system could not be beaten through conquest. To choose peace, then, was not weakness, but a kind of wisdom, a recognition that if the goal was survival, then the warrior path was a dead end. But there were Mandalorians who could not accept that surrender, who saw in Satine's pacifism a betrayal of everything their ancestors had preserved. Pre Vizsla, governor of the Moon Concordia, led a faction called Death Watch, the Kautsad, dedicated to restoring the old ways, to honoring the warrior traditions, to keeping alive the knowledge that had been so carefully maintained through 3,000 years of silence. Pre Vizsla carried the Darksaber, an ancient black-bladed lightsaber forged by Tar Vizsla, the first Mandalorian to become a Jedi Knight, a weapon that symbolized Mandalorian dominance over Force users themselves. To hold the Darksaber was to hold history, the living proof that a Mandalorian could wield even a Jedi's weapon against them. When the Clone Wars erupted, Pre Vizsla and Death Watch saw opportunity, and they made an alliance with Count Dooku and the Separatist movement, believing that chaos in the broader galaxy might give them the opening to reclaim Mandalore from Satine's pacifist government. But Pre Vizsla was not fighting for the Separatists. He was fighting for something far older and more personal, the right of Mandalorians to be what they had always been. Across the battlefields of the Clone Wars, individual Mandalorians and Mandalorian mercenaries took contracts as soldiers and bounty hunters, and they proved something the Jedi needed to learn: that while a Jedi could be invincible against an individual fighter, a trained Mandalorian with superior positioning, Beskar armor, and no inclination toward mysticism could kill one methodically, without drama or difficulty. A Mandalorian did not need to be stronger than a Jedi or more attuned to the Force. They only needed to understand that a lightsaber could not cut Beskar, that a blaster shot from unexpected angles was still lethal, and that a coordinated squad with the right doctrine could isolate and overwhelm a Force user before meditation or precognition could fully save them. The Jedi, for all their power, had become something like keyhole painters, brilliant at seeing and controlling the narrow channel of engagement they expected, and the Mandalorians had learned to fight outside that channel entirely. Pre Vizsla's alliance with Dooku faltered eventually, as such arrangements do, and Death Watch's dreams of conquest remained incomplete as the Clone Wars wore on. But something else was happening, something deeper than political maneuvering. The tension between Satine's pacifism and Pre Vizsla's traditionalism was not a simple matter of peacemongers versus warriors. It was a profound disagreement about what Mandalorians actually were, about whether their identity was forged in the warrior codes of the Rizalnair or whether it could be reinvented entirely. And that disagreement, allowed to fester and grow, would eventually tear Mandalore apart in ways that neither Satine nor Pre Vizsla fully anticipated. Satine had a sister, Bo-Katan Kryze, who understood the appeal of Death Watch's philosophy, who believed in the strength of Mandalore's warrior heritage even as she served in her sister's pacifist government. Bo-Katan walked between two worlds, and that position was not sustainable. By the final years of the Clone Wars, the shape of something darker was forming in the shadows of Mandalorian politics, a convergence of ancient resentments, exile, and the return of figures who had been cast out long before the Clone Wars even began. The Mandalorians had survived 3,000 years by learning how to kill Force users and maintaining that knowledge in silence. And now, as the Clone Wars moved toward its end, they were about to discover whether that patience would finally yield something like victory. The stage was set, though none of them fully understood it yet, for a moment when Mandalorian armor and philosophy would be tested not against scattered Jedi on distant worlds, but against the entire Jedi Order itself, an order that was, by the end of the war, about to fall. And the soldiers carrying blasters, trained in a doctrine descended from Mandalorian tactics, would be the ones to strike the final blow. There is a moment, early in the Clone Wars, when you begin to understand what has actually been put in motion, and it comes not from watching the battles unfold, but from looking at a single man, or rather, at the absence of him. Jango Fett was, by almost any measure that matters, the greatest bounty hunter alive during his era. He wore Beskar armor the color of storm clouds, a Mandalorian inheritance that no lightsaber could cut, and he carried with him 3,000 years of accumulated knowledge about how to kill Force users, knowledge that had been refined through centuries of quiet war, written into his blood and bones by virtue of the culture that made him. What few people understood, and what the Jedi did not understand until far too late, was that Jango Fett was not merely a skilled warrior. He was going to become something far more dangerous, the template. The commission itself had been placed a decade earlier during a time of relative peace, when a Jedi Master named Sifu Dyers, working, though he did not fully comprehend it, under the guiding hand of Darth Tyrannus, who was himself a mask worn by Darth Sidious, had ordered the creation of a clone army from a single genetic source. The Kaminoans, tall and long-necked master geneticists who lived on an ocean world that few in the Republic seemed even to know existed, had been given a simple task: take a man and make 1 million copies of him. And the man they chose, through channels of recruitment and persuasion and money that moved through darkness, was Jango Fett. I think about what that choice meant, and I find myself sitting with the weight of it for a very long time. Here was a culture, the Mandalorians, that had spent 3,000 years learning, through bitter experience and sacrifice, how to defeat the Jedi. They had learned it not through mysticism or hope, but through the patient accumulation of tactical knowledge. How to position yourself so that a lightsaber became less effective. How to armor yourself so that it could not touch you. How to move as a squad so that a single Force user could not divide and overcome you. Jango Fett carried that knowledge in the way he moved, in the weapons he chose, in the armor he wore without question. And now that knowledge was going to be replicated, not once or twice, but across 1 million soldiers. When Obi-Wan Kenobi tracked Jango to Kamino, following the threads of a mystery that led him across the Outer Rim to a world so obscure that it barely registered on most star charts, he found himself standing in the rain on a landing platform, facing a man in Beskar armor, and in that moment, something crystallized. The Jedi had always known, intellectually, that they could be defeated. They were not immortal, not invincible, merely disciplined and fortunate. But Obi-Wan, standing before Jango, understood it in a different way. Here was a man who wore armor that would not yield, who piloted a ship called Slave Eye that moved with lethal precision, who carried blasters and flamethrowers, and the kind of strategic patience that came from knowing, with absolute certainty, that you could kill a Force user if you simply positioned yourself correctly. Jango did not fight Obi-Wan as a man who believed himself to be facing a superior being. He fought him as a problem solver, as someone who understood that the Force was a tool, but not the answer to every tactical question. And when Jango escaped, fleeing to Geonosis with his young, unaltered clone, the boy he had chosen to raise as his son, Boba, the one piece of his bargain that had remained truly his own, he left behind a Jedi who had begun to understand that something very large had just been set in motion. The first battle of Geonosis arrived like a door opening onto a new age. The clone army, millions of soldiers, each of them carrying Jango Fett's face, his DNA, his genetic inheritance, though modified in crucial ways to make them more obedient, more easily controlled, was deployed for the first time. And they fought under the command of Jedi generals, side by side with them, each Jedi leading thousands of soldiers who bore the genetic template of a man who had spent his life learning how to kill Force users. Jango himself died there, beheaded by Mace Windu in a moment of finality that seemed to end something. But the young Boba Fett, watching from a distance, understood what had truly happened. His father's death was not a conclusion, but a transformation. The knowledge that Jango carried, the tactical discipline, the understanding of how to coordinate attacks against a Force user, the absolute faith in armor and training and positioning over mysticism, was now written into the genetic code of 1 million soldiers. And those soldiers were not Mandalorians in the way that Jango was, not in their hearts or their philosophy. They had been engineered to be more compliant, more easily commanded, to age at twice the normal rate, so that they would mature faster and serve longer in the war effort. But they carried something of what Jango carried, and that something was passed into every training session, every deployment, every moment when a Jedi general looked into the faces of his soldiers and saw the same face repeated across battalions. There is something deeply unsettling about it when you think about it long enough. The Jedi had always been taught that the Force was what mattered, that meditation and connection to the living Force and trust in the will of the Force would guide them through any trial. But here, on 100 different battlefields across the Clone Wars, Jedi Knights found themselves fighting alongside an army whose genetic basis, whose very blueprint, came from a man who had rejected that philosophy entirely. Jango Fett had never believed in the Force as a source of power. He had believed in training, in armor, in positioning, in the person next to him who would not fail because their commitment to the mission was absolute. And now 1 million clones carried that belief in their blood, even if they did not fully understand it. The Kaival Dar, Mandalorian trainers and mercenaries, had been brought in by Jango himself to instruct the clone commandos, the most elite units, passing down not just tactical doctrine, but something deeper, a philosophy of warfare that the Jedi had, for 3,000 years, never quite learned how to answer. The tragedy, and I think it is important to sit with this, is that the Jedi, looking at the clone army, saw only soldiers, tools, resources to be deployed. They did not see that they were looking at 3,000 years of Mandalorian anti-Jedi doctrine given physical form, scaled up, and turned into an instrument that would walk beside them on every battlefield. Jango Fett was dead, beheaded on Geonosis, but what he had given, not voluntarily, not in a way he would have chosen, but given nonetheless, would outlast him by decades. His face would be worn by 1 million soldiers. His genetic inheritance would shape the way they thought about combat, about positioning, about the relationship between armor and vulnerability. And hidden in the code of those soldiers, deeper than DNA, was something the Kaminoans had been instructed to put there by masters they did not fully understand. An order that would, at a single command, turn them all against the Jedi at once. That order was called Order 66, and it sat in their neural tissue like a seed waiting for the rain. But that is getting ahead of the story. For now, what matters is understanding what was put in motion on Kamino. In the rain, when a single Mandalorian bounty hunter agreed to become a template, to have his face repeated 1 million times, to have his knowledge and his philosophy scattered across an entire army. It was, in its way, the final refinement of everything the Mandalorians had learned about how to defeat the Jedi. Not through direct conquest, not through a single warrior's skill, but through patience, through placing yourself so close to power that you become inseparable from it. And then, when the moment arrives, through becoming something else entirely. There's a detail about combat that the Jedi spent centuries perfecting that most beings never stop to think about. It happens on the ground, or at least it happens in a plane, a two-dimensional space where positioning and footwork and the arc of a blade matter above all else. The 7 forms of lightsaber combat, refined across 1,000 years of Jedi tradition, were built on the assumption that a duel would be fought at roughly the same elevation, with both combatants moving through space in ways that a trained warrior could anticipate and counter. Even Sorsu, the form that Obi-Wan Kenobi favored, a form built around deflection and tight defensive blade work, was designed to handle attacks that came from a predictable range of angles, all of them roughly level with the warrior's body. The Jedi had learned to feel the Force flowing through the space around them, to sense the movements of their opponents before they happened. But that sense operated within a three-dimensional space that their combat training had only ever truly mastered in 2 dimensions. And then the Mandalorians hung a jetpack on their back. I think about this a lot, because it seems like such a simple thing, a thruster unit, a means of vertical mobility, nothing that on its surface seems like it should matter all that much to a warrior tradition that claimed attunement to the Force as its greatest strength. But there's something in it that reveals a deeper truth about how these 2 cultures thought about warfare itself. The Jedi saw combat as an expression of will channeled through the Force, a conversation between warrior and opponent conducted at the speed of thought and reaction. The Mandalorians saw combat as a geometry problem to be solved through positioning, information, and the unforgiving laws of physics. A jetpack changed the geometry entirely. During the Clone Wars, when Death Watch fighters under Pre Vizsla clashed with Duchess Satine's new Mandalorian forces, and later with Obi-Wan Kenobi's Jedi allies, those clashes revealed something the textbooks had not adequately prepared for. A warrior could come at you from above, reposition instantly to an angle your lightsaber could not easily guard, and strike again before your perception of the Force had fully registered the threat. Jango Fett, who had carried that jetpack into a duel against Obi-Wan Kenobi on Kamino, had demonstrated it in miniature. A rocket-assisted escape, a missile launched downward from an angle Obi-Wan had not anticipated, the kind of asymmetric pressure that forced even a master of Sorsu to adapt faster than his form had been designed to demand. His clone sons would wear it into 10,000 battles, but the standard clone trooper, created from Jango's genetic template, was not equipped with Mandalorian jetpacks. That was specialized knowledge, specialized equipment, kept largely to elite units and to the Mandalorians themselves. It was perhaps the only mercy the galaxy was given, because if 1 million clones had worn jetpacks, if they had all possessed 3-dimensional mobility on top of the doctrine Mandalorian trainers had instilled into their training regimen, the Jedi Order would have fallen not in an instant, but in an inexorable slow motion that no lightsaber could have stopped. What the jetpack represented, more than anything else, was the Mandalorian refusal to fight the war the Jedi expected them to fight. The Jedi expected their opponents to come at them in ways that Sorsu and Form VII Juyo, and all the other forms were designed to counter, expected them to respect the fundamental assumption that a lightsaber duel was a saber-to-saber conversation. The Mandalorians looked at that expectation and decided it was irrelevant. Come from above, they reasoned. Come from an angle. Bring ranged weapons to a melee engagement and force your opponent to divide their attention between parrying blade strikes and deflecting bolts. Fire a missile from behind and reposition while your opponent is still processing that you have moved. The Jedi philosophy, which had been refined through millennia of dueling other Force users and enemies who fought according to recognized principles, had no good answer to a warrior who simply refused to fight according to those principles. Sorsu could deflect blaster bolts beautifully. Obi-Wan Kenobi was perhaps the galaxy's greatest living master of that defense, but even the greatest master of deflection had limits. A warrior who brought overwhelming fire from multiple angles, who could reposition faster than the eye could follow, who combined jetpack-assisted mobility with squad tactics so that your opponent was never truly alone, posed a problem that even the greatest Jedi could not solve through meditation or Force attunement. The three-dimensional advantage that the jetpack granted was, I think, the most underestimated tactical shift in the entire Clone Wars. We remember it as a war of clones against separatists, with Jedi generals commanding great armies across distant worlds. But the truth is simpler and darker than that. It was a war where Mandalorian doctrine, encoded into 1 million soldiers' DNA and reinforced by Mandalorian trainers who had spent their lives studying how to kill Force users, was tested against Jedi defenders in conditions the Jedi had never truly anticipated. A single Mandalorian with a jetpack, Beskar armor, ranged weapons, and 3,000 years of tactical knowledge could not always defeat a Jedi. But a Mandalorian with a jetpack and a squad of trained soldiers, all of them understanding that their job was not to duel, but to overwhelm, to attack from angles the Jedi's training had not prepared them to defend, could make even a master doubt their own invincibility. There's something almost patient in the way the Mandalorians had built this advantage. The jetpack technology was ancient. The Tong had been launching warriors into the skies of Mandalore before the Jedi Order even existed, before the High Republic was more than scattered settlements across the Outer Rim. But they had perfected it, refined it across millennia, until it was not just a novelty, but an integral part of their combat philosophy. Armor protected you from harm that came from the side. The jetpack gave you the angle from which harm was harder to see coming. Training taught you to exploit both. And when the time came, when the Jedi faced an enemy that did not respect their assumptions about how combat should proceed, that accumulated knowledge proved decisive in ways that no individual Jedi could resist. By the end of the Clone Wars, every Jedi in the Order had learned, at some point, the hard way that an enemy who came from above was an enemy that required rethinking everything they had ever been taught about combat. And most of them never got a chance to fully rethink it, because Order 66 came down, and the soldiers they had been fighting alongside, the ones carrying Mandalorian doctrine in their very DNA, turned their jets on and came at them from every angle at once. The jetpack was a small thing, a single piece of equipment, but it represented the most fundamental principle of Mandalorian warfare. Refuse to accept your opponent's terms and make them fight in 3 dimensions instead of 2. By the time the Jedi understood that they had lost control of the geometry of their own combat, it was already too late. The message came through the clone troopers' neural implants as a whisper translated into absolute command, and in that single moment, 3,000 years of Mandalorian doctrine found its truest expression. Not in armor worn by warriors fighting under their own free will, but in soldiers who had no choice but to obey. Somewhere in the depths of the Kaminoan laboratories, where the clone army had been grown in acceleration tanks, the inhibitor chips lay dormant in each soldier's brain. Tiny devices installed alongside their consciousness, waiting for the exact signal that would redefine what they were. On Utapau, Commander Cody stood beside Obi-Wan Kenobi as they had stood together through 3 years of war. And when the order came through, he did not hesitate. He simply fired, and the general who had trusted him fell from his varactile into the waters below. I think about that moment often, about what it means to carry someone's trust so carefully, and then betray it in an instant, not from malice, but from compulsion written into your very being. Kayadi Mundi on Maijito, Arila Secura on Felucia, Plo Koon above Kato Nemoidia, Stas Ali on Salukami. The names are almost secondary to the method, which was always the same. A squad of clone troopers turning on their commanders with the precision and coordination that Mandalorian trainers had drilled into them across years. Each death played out the same way because it was meant to. Jedi caught off guard, surrounded, outnumbered, facing soldiers who had been trained not to duel, but to overwhelm, to attack from angles the Jedi philosophy could not adequately defend, to refuse to engage on Jedi terms. There's something quietly perfect about it, in the way that truly terrible things sometimes are. The Mandalorians had spent 3,000 years learning how to kill Force users through discipline and numbers, and they never needed to fire a shot themselves. The clones who pulled the triggers were not Mandalorians. They were born in laboratories on a water world, grown to adulthood in mere years, taught to follow orders as instinctively as they breathed. But the method was Mandalorian through and through. Beskar-quality armor, squad tactics that prioritized positioning over individual genius, an absolute refusal to let the Force become the deciding factor in combat. In the Jedi Temple on Coruscant, the younglings, the youngest students, some of them barely old enough to hold a lightsaber, died when Anakin Skywalker arrived with the 501st Legion, and the clones simply did what they had been trained to do: clear an objective, eliminate the target. I wonder sometimes what the younglings understood in those final moments, whether they grasped that they were not being killed by soldiers loyal to an enemy, but by the Republic's own defenders acting on orders they could not refuse. Anakin Skywalker, who had been the chosen one, the boy with a midi-chlorian count that off the charts, who had been trained by the greatest Jedi Masters the Order could offer, became the instrument of the Order's destruction, not through his own power alone, but through his willingness to lead soldiers trained in Mandalorian doctrine into the heart of Jedi strength. The tragedy is that Anakin understood, on some level, what he was doing, and did it anyway. The clones were not given even that terrible gift of understanding. Across the Outer Rim, the same scene repeated. Clones turning on their Jedi commanders in coordinated strikes, sometimes in direct violation of the Jedi's own tactical instincts, because the Jedi had been taught that soldiers were loyal and therefore could be trusted, while the Mandalorians, and whoever had trained the clones in Mandalorian tactics, understood that loyalty is a luxury that can be engineered away. Yoda on Kashyyyk felt the deaths pour through the Force like a tidal wave, and he understood immediately that what was happening was not a failure of Jedi foresight, but something far more systematic, far more patient, the culmination of doctrine that had been developed and refined across generations. He decapitated the 2 clone troopers sent to kill him, an old man with a lightsaber, moving with the desperation of someone who has finally been forced to abandon philosophy and simply fight to survive. Obi-Wan Kenobi, when his own soldiers turned on him, fell into the water of Utapau and clung to existence by instinct, by chance, by the smallest margin. A Jedi Master, a general who had commanded respect across the galaxy, reduced to hiding. Both of them later returned to the temple and found it burning, found the recordings of Anakin's betrayal, understood the scope of what had been lost. Not just the lives of thousands of Jedi, but the Order itself, dismantled in a single coordinated strike that the Jedi's philosophy had left them entirely unprepared to defend against. The Mandalorians themselves, the actual Mandalorians, the ones still on Mandalore, were not the ones pulling triggers. Death Watch and the pacifist government alike had been caught in their own civil strife, and many Mandalorian warriors were serving as mercenaries across the galaxy when Order 66 came down. Pre Vizsla and Bo-Katan Kryze, Duchess Satine's sister, were still fighting for control of their world, and by the time they understood what had happened across the Republic, the war was over, the Jedi were gone, and the galaxy had been transformed. What the Mandalorians had learned over 3,000 years was this: that the Jedi could be beaten not by becoming more Force-sensitive, but by refusing to let the Force be the deciding factor, by building strength on what could be touched and taught and replicated, by ensuring that individual brilliance meant nothing when faced with coordinated discipline and superior positioning. In the temple on Coruscant, as the fire spread and the younglings fell and Anakin stood among the clone troopers like the avatar of that exact philosophy, strength through will rather than faith, through armor and aggression rather than meditation and balance, Mandalorian doctrine achieved something its own warriors never could. It broke the Jedi Order utterly. I find myself thinking about the strange irony often. That Jango Fett, who died early in the war, never lived to see the weapon his DNA had become, never witnessed the moment when his genetic blueprint, carrying within it the muscle memory of 3,000 years of anti-Jedi training, walked into the Jedi Temple and ended the Order's existence. The inhibitor chips made the choice impossible to refuse. Yes, but the method, the discipline, the understanding of how to overwhelm Force users through numbers and position that came from the Mandalorians encoded not just in DNA, but in doctrine, in the way the trainers had taught the clones to move, to think, to coordinate. As dawn broke over Coruscant and the fire still burned, the Jedi Order had ceased to exist as an institution. Its members hunted across the galaxy, its temple a tomb. The Mandalorians did not win Order 66, but they did not need to. They had designed the victory 3,000 years before, and it had finally come due. In the months after Order 66, as the smoke cleared from the temple on Coruscant, and the first surviving Jedi began to understand what had been done to them, the Empire faced a peculiar problem that the Mandalorians had spent 3,000 years preparing to solve. The Jedi were scattered now, hunted individually across the galaxy by agents of the new regime, but they were still alive, and a living Jedi, alone and desperate, remains one of the most dangerous things in the galaxy. Palpatine understood this with the clarity of a man who had spent decades thinking about the destruction of the Force users, and he knew that Order 66 had solved only half the problem. The organized Jedi Order was gone, but the survivors would require something else entirely. That something was the Inquisitorius, a core of Force-sensitive agents, most of them fallen Jedi or dark side adepts, trained and unleashed to hunt down the remnants of the Order across every inhabited system. The Grand Inquisitor, a former Jedi temple guard whose name had been erased from the records, led this hunt with the cold precision of a man who knew exactly what he was hunting, because he had once been what he hunted. But even the Inquisitors, for all their dark side power and their intimate knowledge of Jedi weakness, understood something crucial. They alone could not complete the work. So the Empire turned to the one group of people in the known galaxy who had spent millennia learning how to kill Force users without relying on the Force itself. They turned to Mandalorian doctrine. On Mandalore itself, the world was fracturing. Duchess Satine's pacifist government had collapsed with the war, and the siege of Mandalore in the final days of the Clone Wars had left the planet's leadership uncertain and its people divided between those who still believed in the old warrior ways and those who wanted no part of them ever again. Bo-Katan Kryze, who held the Darksaber and the nominal authority to govern, found herself in a precarious position, recognized by the Republic, now the Empire, as Mandalore's leader, yet lacking the true mandate and the military strength to enforce her will. Into this moment of weakness came the machinery of imperial occupation, methodical and absolute. The Empire seized control of the remaining Beskar forges on Concordia and Mandalore itself, understanding that the metal which had shattered lightsabers for 3,000 years could not be allowed to remain in the hands of a warrior culture that had never forgotten how to use it. They confiscated the armor, the weapons, the accumulated technical knowledge, not just the physical objects, but the living memory of how to forge them, how to fight in them, how to coordinate around them. The Mandalorians watched as their inheritance was melted down and restamped with the Imperial seal, transformed into something that belonged to the regime. But there was something else happening beneath the occupation, something more systematic and more terrible. The Empire did not content itself with seizing Mandalorian hardware. They studied it, integrated it, weaponized it through their own apparatus. Imperial officers began requesting Kyval Dar mercenaries, the Mandalorian trainers who had worked with the clones during the wars, asking them to train Imperial troops, to codify the 3,000-year-old philosophy of anti-Jedi combat into formal doctrine that could be taught to stormtroopers and elite units. Some refused and disappeared into the outer reaches. Others, pragmatically or under duress, complied, and the knowledge flowed into Imperial military structure. The result, across the period from 19 to 18 BBY, was a machine unlike anything the galaxy had yet seen. The Inquisitorius provided the Force sensitivity, the dark side power, the intimate knowledge of how Jedi thought and fought, but the methodical coordination, the Beskar armor when it could be preserved, the squad tactics perfected across millennia, these came from Mandalorian philosophy. The hunt became something the ancient Jedi, had never truly faced. A surviving Jedi hiding on a remote world might encounter an Inquisitor alone, a dark side Force user who could press them through meditation and power. But they might also encounter Imperial troops trained in Mandalorian squad tactics, positioned to attack from angles Sorsu deflection could not adequately counter, coordinated with the precision that comes from 3,000 years of refining how to kill Force users without relying on the Force at all. What the Mandalorians had learned in their wars against the Jedi, that discipline and positioning and armor and numbers beat individual genius, became the scaffolding upon which the Empire hung its machinery of extermination. And crucially, the Mandalorians themselves became collateral damage in this process. The Great Purge of Mandalore, the bombardment and subjugation of the planet itself, was not primarily about Jedi at all. It was about denying the Mandalorians the ability to serve as a reserve of anti-Jedi knowledge and capability that might someday rise against Imperial rule. Moff Gideon and other Imperial commanders moved against Mandalore with the singular focus of a regime eliminating a threat, not because Mandalorians were currently powerful enough to defy the Empire, but because history had shown that Mandalorians, given time and unity, could become exactly that threat. The Empire weaponized Mandalorian philosophy and then moved to erase Mandalorian independence so completely that they could never reclaim or repurpose it. I find myself thinking about the bitter irony of this often. The Mandalorians had spent 3,000 years refining the art of killing Jedi, had encoded that knowledge into their armor and their culture and their very language, and in the moment their enemy finally fell, when the last organized Jedi Order was gone, when the philosophy they had opposed had been shattered, they discovered that they had given their enemy an inheritance. The knowledge that made them dangerous to the Jedi became the same knowledge that made them dangerous to an empire that understood its own mortality. The Darksaber, the black-bladed lightsaber created by Tar Vizsla, the first and only Mandalorian Jedi, symbol of Mandalorian leadership across centuries, was seized during the Purge and would eventually pass to Moff Gideon, a mere functionary of the regime, transforming a symbol of Mandalorian independence into a trophy of Imperial conquest. By 18 BBY, when the Purge had achieved its objectives and Mandalore lay scarred and subdued, something essential had shifted in the galaxy's understanding of power. The Jedi had fallen to clone troopers carrying Mandalorian doctrine in their DNA. The Mandalorians had fallen to an empire that had studied them and learned from them, and then destroyed them as an unnecessary variable in its own calculations. But the knowledge remained, dispersed now across 1,000 hidden places, carried in the minds of survivors and exiles, encoded in the few Beskar forges that continued in secret. 3,000 years of philosophy cannot be erased in a year of bombardment, no matter how thoroughly the world is glassed. And somewhere in the quiet aftermath, in the spaces between Imperial patrols, Mandalorians would begin the work of remembering, preserving, preparing, not for conquest now, but for endurance, for the long arc of survival that stretches beyond empires and emperors. The Great Purge was meant to be an ending, but the Mandalorians had learned long ago that endings and beginnings are often the same thing, simply looked at from different angles. In their dispersal, they carried something the Empire could never fully confiscate, the memory of what they had been and the certainty that they would be again. After the Jedi fell, something quiet moved into the spaces they had occupied, not immediately as a grand replacement, but slowly, like water finding cracks in stone. The Jedi had been the galaxy's peacekeepers, or tried to be, and for 1,000 years their presence shaped what order meant. Meditation, the Force, a kind of moral certainty that came from communion with something larger than oneself. When Order 66 was executed on every world at once, when clone troopers, carrying Mandalorian doctrine in their DNA, turned on their generals, the Jedi Order fell in hours. What followed was a kind of collapse that few had anticipated, not a new power rising to replace the old, but a vacuum, a lawlessness that spread through the outer systems and the underworld like a fever. The Empire, in those early years, was consolidating power on Coruscant and the core worlds, but it could not police everywhere at once. The Outer Rim, always wild, became wilder. Tatooine, already home to the Hutt cartels and every shade of criminal enterprise, became more openly a place where law meant nothing and strength meant everything. And into that opening, carrying armor forged 3,000 years before, came the people who had spent all those centuries learning how to survive when the Force users fell. Boba Fett was born on Kamino in a vat as one of millions, an exact copy of his father, Jango Fett, down to the gene. But Jango, the man who had been the genetic template for the entire clone army, had requested one thing: one unmodified clone, raised as his son, given a name, given a life beyond the factory. Boba was that one. He grew up watching his father move through the underworld with a reputation that seemed to precede him like a shadow. Jango Fett, the Mandalorian bounty hunter, a man who wore Beskar armor and spoke with an accent that marked him as someone who had survived something larger than himself. And then, at the first battle of Geonosis, the young Boba watched Mace Windu, one of the greatest Jedi Knights in the Order, cut his father's head from his shoulders. It was 22 BBY, the very beginning of the Clone Wars, and in a single moment, Boba learned something the Jedi would spend the next 3 years trying to forget. That Jedi could die, that even great ones could fall, and that a father's armor and weapons did not die with him. Jango left to Boba a ship called Slave Eye, a Firespray-class patrol craft with the modifications of someone who had been hunted and had learned to hunt in turn. Sleek, fast, weaponized, equipped with systems that belonged in the hands of someone who understood that killing mattered more than honor. He left to him Beskar armor, not because Boba was Mandalorian by birth. That is a complicated question, and the underworld argued about it for years. But because the armor was what his father had chosen to be, and that choice seemed to matter more than bloodline ever could. Most importantly, Jango left to Boba the knowledge that he was the genetic source for 1 million soldiers, that his face and body had been copied across the entire clone army, that somewhere in the architecture of all those troops carried vestigial echoes of his father's mind and muscle memory. Boba carried all of this: a dead father, living armor, a ship, and the strange inheritance of being the original of which millions were copies. And as the Clone Wars escalated, as Jedi fought across the galaxy against opponents trained in Mandalorian tactics, as the underworld watched and understood what was happening, Boba began to move. He was young, barely into his teens when Jango died, but the underworld has always measured age differently than civilized worlds do. He learned from Cad Bane, the Duro's bounty hunter who was, in those years, perhaps the most feared hunter in the galaxy, a man who took contracts others would not consider and completed them with a ferocity that made even hardened criminals look twice. Boba watched Cad Bane move through jobs with a kind of cold calculation that had nothing to do with the Force and everything to do with preparation, positioning, and the willingness to do what needed doing. There's a clarity in that kind of work, I think, for someone like Boba. Clarity without philosophy, without moral apparatus, just the clean line between contract and completion. By the time the Clone Wars ended, Boba Fett was no longer a grieving child, but a hunter moving in the circles where the Empire's rise was creating opportunities. Fugitives to track, dissidents to find, and most crucially, surviving Jedi to hunt. The Great Purge, the Empire's systematic elimination of Jedi across the galaxy, created a kind of economy of violence that the underworld understood intuitively. Mandalorians had spent 3,000 years learning how to kill Force users. Now the Empire needed people who possessed that knowledge, and it was willing to pay. The irony, though the Mandalorians would not fully comprehend it until much later, was that the Empire had weaponized their doctrine to destroy the Jedi. But in doing so, it had also marked Mandalorians as potential threats to Imperial power. Mandalore itself was glassed, the forges destroyed or seized, the warrior culture scattered and seemingly broken. but the knowledge, the armor, the philosophy that could not be glassed away. It lived in people like Boba Fett. In the years after 19 BBY, as the Empire solidified its grip and the underworld settled into its new shape, Boba Fett built a reputation that became myth. He was not the Jedi's equal. He was something else, something the Jedi philosophy had never quite accounted for. A hunter without attachment, without the Force, without the burdens of moral certainty, who understood violence as a craft and pursued it with precision. He took contracts that killed senators and dissidents. He hunted enemies of the Empire and survived encounters that left other hunters dead. His armor became recognizable across the underworld as a symbol of someone you did not want hunting you, because Boba Fett, unlike the Jedi before him, did not hesitate and did not believe that the Force would guide his hand. He believed in Beskar, in preparation, in the ship beneath him, and in the simple contractual certainty that if you paid him, he would finish the work. In this way, the Mandalorian philosophy, the one that had been forged 3,000 years before to answer the Jedi, found its truest expression not in armies, but in a single hunter, carrying his father's armor, flying his father's ship, embodying a way of surviving in a universe that had just lost its guardians. The Jedi fell believing that the Force would sustain them, and it did not. What rose in their absence was something simpler and perhaps more durable, a code that asked for nothing from the cosmos except the strength of your own hand, the reliability of your equipment, and the contracts that gave your violence meaning. Boba Fett did not think of himself as the heir to 3,000 years of anti-Jedi doctrine. He did not know, perhaps, that he carried in his cells and his instincts the accumulated memory of a culture that had never stopped preparing for the moment when the Force users fell. But that is what he was. And in the silence after the Jedi Order shattered, his presence in the underworld became something the galaxy had not encountered before. The Mandalorian way, stripped of its need for armies or conquest, moving through the lawless places as the dominant philosophy of survival, quiet, lethal, patient, and utterly indifferent to mysticism. There is something worth sitting within that. The thing that had taken 3,000 years to build, the thing that had shattered the greatest order in the galaxy, did not announce itself or declare victory. It simply became the way things were done, in the places where the Jedi's light no longer reached. 5 years after the Emperor fell, and the Galactic Empire fractured into warlord remnants and scattered fleets, a man in Beskar armor arrived at a small settlement in the Outer Rim, asking questions about work and payment, moving through the galaxy with the patient discipline of someone who had been taught, since childhood, that the only thing you can truly trust is what you can touch and wear and understand. He was called Din Djarin, though almost no one who knew him ever heard his voice. The creed he followed, the way of the Children of the Watch, forbade him to remove his helmet in the presence of any living being, and so he remained behind that mask, a walking principle rather than a man. There is something almost noble in that choice, when you think about it. To obscure yourself entirely, to let your actions speak alone, to refuse the comfort of recognition or witness to your face. It echoes something very old in Mandalorian culture, the idea that what matters is not who you are but what you do, not your name but your code. He had been orphaned during the Clone Wars on Akvatina when separatist battle droids killed his parents, and instead of being left alone, he had been taken in by Death Watch Mandalorians, the radical faction that had spent a century preserving the old ways, while the rest of Mandalore turned toward peace and domes and cities that looked like surrender. Din learned from them what Mandalorians had learned 3,000 years before, that armor is truth, that discipline is survival, that the Force is powerful but does not make you unbeatable if you have Beskar and positioning and a clear mind. When the Empire rose and then fell, when Mandalore itself was glassed in the Great Purge and scattered across light years, the Children of the Watch did not scatter the same way. They held together in small coverts, moving between worlds, maintaining the forges, teaching foundlings the creed, waiting with the patient certainty that the Mandalorian way would outlast whatever came next. And so in the year 9 ABY, Din Djarin moved through the underworld as a bounty hunter, taking contracts through the Guild, flying a scarred pre-Empire assault ship called the Razor Crest, carrying with him the accumulated weight of 3,000 years of Mandalorian knowledge. And he did not know yet that he was about to meet the thing that would force Mandalorian culture to evolve in ways no war had ever demanded. He was hired by Imperial remnants, by men with careful eyes and expensive clothing who wanted something very specific. A 50-year-old asset, a creature they had been holding in a lab for decades, worth enough to justify a manhunt across the rim. When Din brought him back, he found himself looking at a child, a small, green, wide-eared being who was afraid, and something in the creed Din carried, in the principle of adoption and foundling right that had been written into Mandalorian law since the Taung walked the wastes of Mandalore, made him incapable of handing the child over. This was not a failure of duty. This was Mandalorian duty itself, the responsibility to shelter those who cannot shelter themselves, to bring them into your clan through covenant rather than blood. The child was Force-sensitive, belonged to the same species as Master Yoda, the ancient Jedi, and Imperial scientists had wanted to study him to dissect the mechanism of his power. But Din Djarin understood something the Jedi never quite seemed to, that a person cannot be reduced to power, that strength without honor is only hunger. For 3 years, Din carried the child, later given the name Grogu, across the galaxy, breaking with the Bounty Hunters Guild, defying Imperial warlords, learning slowly that the Mandalorian creed and the protection of a foundling were not separate duties, but the same duty, spoken in different languages. And here is where the resurgence truly begins. Not in military victory, not in conquest of worlds, but in the survival of a principle so fundamental that even an orphaned human and a Force-sensitive child of an extinct Jedi species could be knit together by its strength. The children of the Watch maintained a covert on Nevarro under the leadership of the Armorer, a woman who had preserved the ancient forges, who could look at scavenged Imperial Beskar and transform it into armor that would last lifetimes. She taught Din and other foundlings not just how to fight, but how to be, how to move through a broken galaxy with unbreakable discipline, how to follow the way even when the way asked you to give up the one comfort most people cannot live without, the sight of your own reflection. When Din removed his helmet in the presence of others, when he looked into Grogu's eyes unmasked, when he showed his face to people he had sworn to protect, he was committing apostasy, breaking the creed in the most fundamental way. But the creed itself contained the answer: redemption through service, through walking willingly into harder trials, through the willingness to be remade in the image of your oath. He descended into the living waters beneath Mandalore's ruins, into places where ancient Mandalorians had once tamed the mythosaurs themselves. And there in the darkness, he was pulled under by a creature so vast, so old, so perfectly alive, that it rewrote what it meant to be Mandalorian. Because a Mandalorian is not someone who rules through fear or strength alone, but someone who earns the right to lead through unshakable covenant with the world around them. When Bo-Katan Kryze, who had once held the Darksaber and sought to restore Mandalore through the old ways of dominance and bloodline, witnessed that mythosaur rise in the depths, she understood something that conquest could never have taught her, that the Mandalorian resurgence would not come from the creed being abandoned, but from the creed being remembered so purely that it transformed everyone who followed it. Din Djarin took up the Darksaber, not through cunning or ambition, but through simple circumstance and willingness to fight when fighting was required. And then he gave it away, pledging himself and the blade to Bo-Katan's vision of a united Mandalore. This is the philosophy that outlasted the Jedi Order itself. That strength is not something you hoard, that power is not something you wield alone, that the deepest resilience comes not from individual genius, but from a covenant so solid that any person who enters it becomes unbreakable. Grogu, the child who carried the Force within him, chose to walk away from Luke Skywalker's fledgling Jedi Academy and return to Din, choosing the armor and the family, and the creed over the path of the Force user. He was renamed Din Grogu, a foundling, a Mandalorian, more bound to earth and steel, and the word that binds than to any mystical connection. And in that choice lives the final truth, that where the Jedi Order fell because it built itself on faith in forces beyond the self, the Mandalorians endured because they had always built themselves on the concrete things, on people standing next to you, on the armor you forge yourself, on the creed you choose to follow every single day. After the fall of the Empire, after the persecution and the glassing and the decades of exile, Mandalorian culture resurrected itself not through reconquest, but through something far more durable, through the simple, stubborn refusal to forget what it meant to be Mandalorian, and the willingness to teach that meaning to anyone who would listen, whether they were born to it or came to it as orphans. The way endured, and in its endurance, it carried something the Jedi Order never could, the knowledge that truth is not something you feel in a cosmic consciousness, but something you prove every day by keeping your word to the people standing beside you. This is the resurgence. There is a moment in every long conflict when you begin to understand that your enemy was not prepared to lose the way you were prepared to lose, that the very foundation of how they built themselves was different from how you built yourself. The Jedi, across 3,000 years, had centered their entire philosophy on a single object, the lightsaber, a blade of pure energy sustained by a kyber crystal attuned to the living force. Kyber crystals are not mere stones. They are force-sensitive, alive in a way that defies easy explanation, and when a Jedi, through meditation and alignment with the Force itself, attunes to a crystal, the bond between user and weapon becomes something transcendent. The kyber's light emerges as an expression of the wielder's connection to the Force, and a perfectly attuned blade becomes not just a tool, but an extension of the Jedi's own will and power. Everything the Jedi built, their 7 forms of combat, their training, their entire martial doctrine, was architecture built around mastery of this one object. That means their strength was concentrated, tremendous, yes, but channeled through a single point of focus, a single blade in a single hand. The Mandalorians, over the same 3,000 years, had built something quietly opposite. They did not center themselves on one perfect object. They centered themselves on one perfect material. Beskar, the iron of their world, refined and folded and beaten until it could do something nothing else could do. Beskar did not sing with the Force. It did not attune to the wielder's spiritual alignment. It simply resisted. A lightsaber blade, plasma contained in a magnetic field generated by a kyber crystal, could cut through almost anything, stone, metal, flesh, starship hull. But it could not cut Beskar, not cleanly, not reliably. There's a profound difference between those two approaches, and I find myself thinking about it more the longer I sit with the story. One is built on power flowing outward, the Force channeled through a crystal, made manifest as a blade that can do anything. The other is built on durability, on saying, no, nothing will pass here, nothing will cut this. This is the line that does not move. Power that acts, and resilience that endures, two different philosophies of what strength means. The Mandalorian armor, Beskar in its fullest expression, was not a single weapon, it was a system. The Vambrace flamethrower, the whipcord launcher, the dart dispenser, the jetpack, the rangefinder HUD, the resonator that could detect motion through walls. These were not afterthoughts bolted onto armor, they were part of the whole. Where a Jedi had one blade, a Mandalorian warrior had 5 ways to attack, 4 ways to retreat, 3 ways to change the battlefield, and armor that meant they could survive a mistake. A lightsaber can cut almost anything, but if you are wearing Beskar and your enemy is 100 meters away with a flamethrower and a jetpack, the question of whether the lightsaber can cut you becomes almost secondary. You have already been hit, you are already burning, the attacker is already gone. The Jedi had trained for dueling, for direct confrontation, for the moment where opponent stands against opponent and will decide the outcome. Every form of lightsaber combat, Makashi, Shurcho, Sorsu, Ataru, Gemso, Shin, Juyo was built around that moment. The Mandalorians had trained for everything except that moment. They trained for ambush, for overwhelming numbers, for attacking from angles a single opponent cannot defend, for ranged weapons that do not require you to be within arm's length, for armor that means you can take hits that would kill anyone else, for the knowledge that the person shooting at you is part of a squad, and if you kill them, the other 5 will kill you. When the Jedi finally faced organized Mandalorians, truly organized, not scattered mercenaries, but coordinated military force with doctrine and discipline, it was like 2 civilizations built from entirely different materials, suddenly discovering that one material cannot cut the other. The thing that is most important to notice, I think, is that this was not a flaw in lightsaber design, nor a flaw in Mandalorian armor. It was not a surprise that Beskar could not be cut. The Mandalorians had known this for 3,000 years, had built an entire culture around it. It was not a weakness that the lightsaber was a single blade. The Jedi had built their entire philosophy around the mastery of that one perfect tool. The problem was that neither side had been built to counter the other, because for most of those 3,000 years, they did not encounter each other directly. When they finally did, when Mandalore, the ultimate, declared war on the Republic, when Revan learned to think like a Mandalorian general, when Jango Fett's DNA was encoded into a clone army, when Order 66 was issued, and millions of soldiers trained in Mandalorian doctrine turned on the Jedi discovered something that no amount of Force attunement could overcome. Kyber beats almost everything. It is brilliant and powerful and can cut through starship plating. But Beskar does not break. A Kyber blade can strike Beskar 1,000 times and not advance an inch. The armor simply absorbs the impact, distributes the force, and remains unbroken. The philosophical difference underneath this is what matters. The Jedi built a weapon that could defeat anything, and the Mandalorians built armor that nothing could penetrate. One is built on the assumption of victory through superior power. The other is built on the assumption of survival through superior resilience. And when victory requires you to penetrate something that cannot be penetrated, what is the point of power? In the medieval age on Mandalore, when their culture crystallized into its final form, the Mandalorians chose something very deliberate. They said, "We will not build weapons to match the Jedi's weapons. We will build armor to deny them the victory they expect." That is the choice that echoes through everything that follows. By the time the Clone Wars come around, by the time Death Watch mercenaries in Beskar face Jedi Knights in their robes, the asymmetry is almost complete. The Jedi have a tool that can cut almost anything. The Mandalorians have a material that almost nothing can cut. The Jedi have trained to fight one opponent at a time. The Mandalorians have trained to overwhelm from multiple angles simultaneously. The Jedi have the Force. The Mandalorians have memory, discipline, and 3,000 years of knowing exactly how you fight because your philosophy has not changed in centuries. The Darksaber, that unique black blade created by Tar Vizsla, the first Mandalorian Jedi, around 1,000 years before the Clone Wars, sits at the intersection of both worlds, and perhaps that is why it became so important. It is a lightsaber, kyber-powered, force-attuned, but it is also the symbol of Mandalorian rulership, the crown of a warrior people. The Darksaber says, "We understand your weapon, we have incorporated it into ourselves, but the true power is not in the blade, it is in what stands behind it." In the end, the reason the Mandalorians were the one enemy the Jedi could never really beat is not mystical. It is architectural. The Jedi built themselves around a philosophy of power, the ability to do extraordinary things through the Force and a perfect blade. The Mandalorians built themselves around a philosophy of resistance, the absolute refusal to be defeated by conventional means. When a civilization built on power meets a civilization built on resilience, and the only way to win is to break the resilience, then power becomes almost irrelevant. The Jedi had everything a warrior could ask for: strength, speed, prescience, and a weapon beyond compare. And still they fell, not because they were weak, but because they were never designed to face something that would not break. And the Mandalorians knew this, had always known this, had built themselves from the beginning with the absolute certainty that the Force was powerful but not omnipotent, and that armor, discipline, and the will to endure could answer anything else. It occurs to me that we've reached a moment now where I should pause and ask you to think about what legacy actually means, because the Mandalorians have one that extends far beyond military victory or conquest or the possession of any world. After the Empire fell, after Mandalore was glassed and scattered, after the temples were empty and the Jedi were gone, the question was not whether the Mandalorians had won. They hadn't, not in any conventional sense, but whether they had become something that could not be unmade. Boba Fett, in those years after the Galactic Civil War, was perhaps the clearest symbol of what that means. A man in Beskar armor, carrying 3,000 years of doctrine inside him, answerable to no force and no philosophy but his own code. He didn't need an army. He didn't need a planet. He needed a ship, a reputation, and the knowledge that he could walk into any room and be the most dangerous thing in it, not because of mysticism, but because of what he had been taught and what he had survived. By the time Din Djarin emerged from the covert enclaves in 9 ABY, the Mandalorian way had transformed from something meant to conquer into something meant to endure, and endurance had become its own form of power. I want you to understand what that means. A single man in armor, following a code that predates the modern Jedi Order, protecting a Force-sensitive child not because he understood the Force, but because his creed said foundlings were his to protect. The armorer, whose face we never see, guards the forges and the old knowledge as though she were a priestess in a temple, because in a real sense she is, the keeper of everything Mandalore learned about survival across 3,000 years. When Din descends into the living waters of Mandalore itself and encounters the mythosaur, that moment carries weight that goes back to the very beginning of these stories, to creatures older than the Mandalorians themselves, to a world that taught its people that survival was possible in the most hostile circumstances imaginable. Bo-Katan Kryze, who once fought for Death Watch and later for pacifism, and finally for the liberation of her world, represents something crucial. The Mandalorians learned, over centuries, that power comes in many forms, and that the willingness to change tactics without losing your core identity might be the truest form of strength. The Darksaber itself, that black-bladed lightsaber forged by Tar Vizsla when he was both Jedi and Mandalorian, became less a weapon and more a symbol of something that cannot be conquered because it is held in consensus rather than force. When Din Djarin places the Darksaber in Bo-Katan's hands, he is not crowning a ruler. He is passing forward the consent of the people, and that distinction matters because it speaks to something the Jedi Order never quite understood about lasting power. A kingdom ruled by fear of a single blade falls the moment that blade is broken or lost. A people bound by covenant and code endure across generations, across the glassing of their world, across exile and scattering, and the collapse of everything they built. I find myself thinking about this a lot. The Jedi were masters of the extraordinary, of individual genius and mystical connection, and they were destroyed not by something extraordinary, but by ordinary soldiers following orders, by Beskar armor, by squad tactics that any disciplined warrior could execute. But the Mandalorians were not destroyed, because they were never singular in the way the Jedi were. They were always a people, always a creed, always distributed across dozens of clans and foundlings who could carry the knowledge forward even when the world itself was set aflame. Canderous Ordo understood this in the aftermath of Malacha V. He saw that conquest was impossible, but survival was not, and he committed to the harder work of preservation, which is to say he committed to the belief that outlasting your enemy across centuries is itself a form of victory. The Great Purge of Mandalore, where the Empire glassed the world and scattered the population, should have been an extinction event, the kind of catastrophe that erases a culture entirely. But the Mandalorians had learned long before that their culture lived not in one world, but in the Rizalnir, in the Forges, in the creed that could be passed between a Mandalorian and a foundling regardless of bloodline or birth. This is what makes them unkillable. Not their armor, though the armor matters deeply, but the fact that you cannot kill an idea by bombing its planet. And the Mandalorian way is not a kingdom or a bloodline or a genetic inheritance. It is an idea, a set of principles that any being willing to walk the way can claim. When the new Mandalorians chose pacifism and retreated behind domed cities, House Vizsla refused to let that be the end of the story. Death Watch preserved the old knowledge in hidden forges and in memory, patient and perfect, waiting for the moment when the galaxy would remember that there are some truths that cannot be negotiated away. Jango Fett carried that knowledge into his cells, and it was written into the genome of 1 million clone troopers, and it became the mechanism by which the Jedi Order was finally broken, not by Mandalorians in battle, but by Mandalorian doctrine inscribed so deeply that it moved through clone soldiers like breathing. The irony, and I do think there is something darkly beautiful in this irony, is that the Jedi could have studied what the Mandalorians knew, could have sat with the philosophy that Beskar and discipline and code might answer what the Force alone could not. But they had built themselves on the certainty that the Force was ultimate, and that certainty became their blindness. Every Jedi eventually encounters a Mandalorian and learns that the Force is real and powerful, but not total, not omnipotent, not the answer to every question. And by that moment, it is often too late, because the lesson is written in lightsaber-assistant armor and comes with a person attached to it who will not yield. What the Mandalorians have become, in the aftermath of everything, is the standard against which every warrior in the galaxy now measures themselves. Not because they won a great war, but because they survived one and refused to stop being what they were in the process. A bounty hunter who wants to be taken seriously wears armor inspired by Beskar designs. A soldier who wants to be elite trains in squad tactics derived from Mandalorian doctrine. A mercenary who wants to walk into a negotiation with leverage studies, what Mandalorians know about positioning and preparation. The Jedi are gone, their temples empty, their order shattered. And what replaced them was not a new force-wielding tradition, but the slow, patient ascension of Mandalorian philosophy as the dominant survival ethic of the known galaxy. Strength in the post-Jedi world is no longer measured in midi-chlorians or lightsaber forms or communion with the living Force. It is measured in Beskar, in preparation, in the unshakable confidence that you have trained for this moment and positioned yourself to control its outcome. And that transformation from military enemy to cultural standard, from a faction defeated at Malacha V to the template by which galactic competence is measured, might be the most complete victory the Mandalorians ever won, because it required no conquest, no army, no single moment of triumph, only the patient refusal to become anything less than what they had always been. I think about Din Djarin sometimes, alone in the covert enclaves before he emerged, keeping the creed alive among hidden Mandalorians who refused to accept that their world was gone or their way was obsolete. And I understand that the true legacy of the Mandalorians is not a person or a place, but that refusal, that absolute commitment to endurance. When you measure yourself against the standard of Mandalorian excellence, when you assume that an opponent in Beskar armor will be disciplined and prepared and positioned for your weakness, when you understand that the Force is powerful but not guaranteed, you are inheriting 3,000 years of hard-won knowledge, paid for in blood and loss, and the terrible clarity that comes only from surviving what should have killed you. The Mandalorians became the unkillable myth not because they could not be killed. They have been killed, thousands of them, across the centuries. But because the way they think, the way they prepare, the way they refuse to yield cannot be unmade so long as there are people willing to walk it. And somewhere in the quiet, in the way Din watches over a foundling who could become a Jedi, but chooses instead to become a Mandalorian, you can see that knowledge being passed forward again, the creed being whispered into the next generation, and the cycle of survival continuing into whatever comes next. Tonight, I want to tell you something quiet, something that has been settling in me for a long time now, about why the Mandalorians outlasted everything that should have broken them. The Jedi Order fell in a single night. Order 66, coordinated across the galaxy, a command whispered into the neural tissue of 1,000,000 soldiers, and by dawn, an institution that had stood for 10,000 years was reduced to scattered survivors hiding in the dark. The Mandalorians, by contrast, have never truly fallen, even when their world was glassed, and their forges were melted, and their people were scattered across the galaxy with nothing but the armor on their backs and the words they carried in their hearts. This is not because they were stronger, or more numerous, or blessed by fate in any way that the Jedi were not. It is because they understood something about truth that the Jedi never quite grasped. The Jedi built their entire civilization on faith, faith in the Force, faith that the will of the Force would guide them, faith that if they were sufficiently attuned and sufficiently disciplined, the Force would provide the answers they needed. This faith was not naive. I want to be careful about that. The Jedi genuinely felt the Force. They moved through it. They lived inside it. And for 10,000 years that faith sustained them and made them powerful beyond measure. But faith, by its nature, requires that something larger than yourself carry you. And when that something is destroyed, there is nothing left to hold you up. The Mandalorians, by contrast, built their civilization on something much simpler, on the refusal to require anything they could not touch. They built it on Beskar, which is real. You can hold it in your hand, you can feel its weight, you can trust it because it does not require belief. They built it on the Rizalnir, the 6 actions, a code so practical and so concrete that it could be lived by anyone, of any species, in any circumstance, as long as they had the will to follow it. Wear the armor, speak the language, defend yourself and family, raise children as Mandalorians, contribute to the clan, rally to the Mandala when called. There is no mysticism in this. There is no invisible force to attune yourself to. There is only the thing you can do, right in front of you today. And I think that is why they survived. When the temple on Coruscant was burning and the Jedi were being hunted, they were being hunted by an enemy that had stolen their own doctrine and turned it into a weapon. An army trained in Mandalorian tactics, built from Mandalorian DNA, coordinated through positioning and squad discipline rather than through any connection to the Force. The Jedi could not adapt because they had built themselves to be singular, exceptional, guided by something larger than themselves. But Din Djarin, a man with no Force sensitivity at all, carrying nothing but armor and a code, could survive in that same hostile galaxy. Bo-Katan Kryze could rebuild from the wreckage, fractured as she was, because the Mandalorian way does not require a single leader or a central institution or even a homeworld to survive. It only requires people who are willing to carry it forward. There's something in that which I find myself thinking about more and more. The Jedi Order was destroyed, but Mandalorians cannot be destroyed in the same way because Mandalorians are not an order at all. They are a covenant. An order can be decapitated, its temple burned, its sacred texts lost, its leadership hunted to extinction. But a covenant exists in every person who chooses to carry it, in every hand that forges Beskar, in every voice that speaks Mandor, in every child raised to understand that family is more than blood. This is the phrase they use. Aliat Orashir Taldin, family is more than blood. The Jedi had bloodlines too, in a way, the lineages of masters and apprentices, the dynasties of teaching and learning that stretched across centuries. But that lineage depended on the survival of the institution that carried it forward. The moment the institution fell, those lineages broke. The Mandalorian covenant, by contrast, does not depend on any institution at all. It depends only on memory and repetition, on one person teaching another to forge Beskar the way it was forged before. On one person teaching another the words of Mandor the way they were spoken before. On one person raising a child, foundling or blood, to understand that strength is not something that happens to you, but something you choose to carry. And in this way, Mandalorians survived the Great Purge that destroyed their world, survived the scattering that sent their people into exile, survived centuries of quiet dispersal across the underworld and the rim and the margins of galactic civilization where no one was looking for them. They survived because Boba Fett, a man with no Jedi training, could be just as lethal as a Jedi Knight. They survived because Din Djarin, a foundling raised in secrecy during the war, could live and raise a Force-sensitive child according to the old codes without needing any permission from anyone. They survived because an armorer could still remember how to forge Beskar, could still teach it, could still speak the words of the Rizalnea while shaping the metal, keeping the knowledge alive in her hands and in her voice. And when Mandalore was rebuilt, slowly, carefully, by people working without armies or institutions or grand declarations, it was rebuilt not as a return to what had been, but as a resumption of something that had never truly been broken, because it had never lived in any one place to begin with. There is a wisdom in this that I think the Jedi, for all their power and insight, never quite understood. The Jedi believed that strength flowed outward, that if you were sufficiently attuned to the Force, you could project your will across the galaxy. The Mandalorians understood something different. That strength comes from the refusal to break, and the refusal to break comes from building yourself on things that cannot be broken, on code, on covenant, on the simple and unshakable commitment to the people beside you and the work that is yours to do. The Jedi sought to transcend the material world through the Force. The Mandalorians chose to build their world out of materials, Beskar, language, ritual, the physical act of raising a child. And in that choice, they created something that outlasted not only the Jedi Order but the Empire itself, and will likely outlast whatever comes next. This is the way. Not a way of meditation or transcendence or cosmic destiny, but a way that can be walked by anyone, anywhere, at any time, with nothing but the will to carry it forward. And in the end, I think that is the real victory. Not that the Mandalorians beat the Jedi in combat, though they did, and not that they survived when the Jedi fell, though they did that as well, but that they created a form of life and strength and human dignity that does not require anything external to validate it, that cannot be destroyed from the outside, because it lives in the choices of ordinary people doing ordinary things in accordance with a code. This is what it means to outlast, not to conquer, but to refuse to disappear, to keep building the same thing, the same way, over and over again, until the world itself has no choice but to accept that you are still here.